The most powerful military force in the wasteland began as a group of soldiers who simply refused to go home. They sealed a door behind them. They never opened it again. And for 200 years, no one outside their walls was ever told the full truth of what they kept inside. Welcome to this quiet journey. Find a comfortable place. Let the weight of the day settle around you. Tonight, the Brotherhood of Steel opens its hidden files, records that were sealed, buried, and never intended for outside eyes. Each chapter will take you to one specific place, and inside that place, the files will open. Let me know in the comments where you are listening from tonight, and if these quiet transmissions are new to you, subscribe so the next journey finds you easily. The Lost Hills Bunker. Southern California. Deep beneath the surface, behind doors that were never meant to be found, the Brotherhood of Steel was born. The air inside these walls carries a specific quality, cool, recycled, holding the faint metallic weight of machinery that has been running without interruption for generations. The overhead lights in the deeper levels burn with a pale, steady glow. Every corridor that can be labeled has been labeled. Every surface that can be filed flat has been filed flat. The Lost Hills Bunker is not a place where things are left to chance, or feeling, or decay. It was built to last. It was built to remember. And the first thing it remembered, the thing that made all other remembering necessary, began not here, but in a hallway several hundred miles north, where a captain read something he was never supposed to read. The Brotherhood of Steel was not founded by a general or a politician. It was founded by Captain Roger Maxson, who had just executed his own commanding officer. At Mariposa military base, Maxson discovered that the soldiers under his command had been forcing civilian scientists to work on the Forced Evolutionary Virus, or FEV, a biological weapon program so classified that most of the soldiers guarding the facility had no idea what they were actually protecting. When the full scope of the experiment was revealed to him through recovered documents, Maxson made a decision that had no precedent in any military handbook. He declared his unit independent from the United States government and transmitted that declaration on open radio channels, hours before the bombs fell across the continent. No one responded. The government he was defecting from had already ceased to exist. What remained of his unit, his family members, and the surviving civilian scientists became the first members of an order that would one day reach across the entire wasteland. The Brotherhood of Steel began not with a battle. It began with a broadcast sent into silence. That silence was deliberate. The Brotherhood's earliest radio communications were conducted on a frequency chosen to match pre-war military emergency channels. A decision made so that any surviving government units might still reach them, might still respond, might confirm that something of the old world had endured. No government units ever did. But the Brotherhood kept that frequency active for decades, long after any reasonable hope of a reply had passed. The transmissions sent across that frequency still carry the formal structure of pre-war military communication: call signs, unit designations, chain of command acknowledgements, broadcast into a wasteland that no longer has a military to receive them. The formality was not preserved for function. It was preserved for identity. An organization that had lost everything it once served continued to speak in the language of that lost institution, because the language was one of the only things left. In the wasteland, identity is often held together by nothing more than the words that survive when everything else does not. Dust has settled into the grooves of the bunker's lower storage panels, undisturbed for years, because the scribe's work above and the sealed levels below have not been opened in living memory. When Maxson led his soldiers and their families on the march from Mariposa to Lost Hills, they carried weapons, medical supplies, and pre-war military manuals. But the most carefully guarded items were not weapons. They were technical documents, schematics, engineering blueprints, chemistry references, stripped from the Mariposa facility before departure under Maxson's direct order. These documents became the Brotherhood's founding library. The Lost Hills bunker was built, in significant part, to house them. 200 years later, the scribes of the Brotherhood are still copying and recopying those original documents by hand, a practice that began as practical duplication and became, over generations, something closer to ceremony. The newest scribes copy documents whose origins they have never been told, in handwriting that will itself be copied by scribes not yet born. What began as survival became ritual. The Brotherhood's deepest belief is not in any doctrine. It is in the act of writing things down. That act of writing produced a structure no pre-war military handbook had ever anticipated. The Brotherhood's three-tier hierarchy, initiates, scribes, and knights, ascending toward paladins and elders, was not drawn from the United States Army. Roger Maxson invented it. Background records at Lost Hills make clear that Maxson modeled the Brotherhood's internal structure loosely on medieval knightly orders, organizations that preserved knowledge and military discipline simultaneously during periods of societal collapse. He had been reading about the Knights Templar in the weeks before the bombs fell. The Brotherhood's oath language, their concept of the order, and even their title of elder all trace back to that reading. A soldier alone in a bunker, with the old world ending above him, redesigned civilization from a history book. The institution that now controls power armor and energy weapons across the wasteland was sketched out by a man who was reading about knights. Within these walls, the First Elder Council met not as a governing body, but as an argument that refused to end. Maxson's original soldiers disagreed on a single question that has never been resolved in Brotherhood history. Some believed that the technology the Brotherhood had gathered should be shared freely, that rebuilding civilization required giving people the tools to build. Others believed that uncontrolled technology had caused the war, and that the same tools given too freely to an unstable population would simply produce the same result. That argument, isolation versus outreach, became the Brotherhood's original fracture point. Every major split since then traces a line back to that first debate inside Lost Hills. The Brotherhood did not fracture because of outside enemies. It fractured because of a question it asked itself on its very first night and never answered. The shape of that fracture was formed by what the Brotherhood did with the technology it could not agree to share. The hoarding system, the systematic collection of pre-war weapons, armor, and devices, was designed by Maxson as a controlled distribution model, not a permanent lockdown. The original plan was to assess each recovered technology, determine its potential for harm, and release it to communities that demonstrated readiness. The assessment stage never ended. Items collected in the first post-war decades remain in storage at Lost Hills, catalogued by scribes who were born long after those items were brought in, using release criteria that were never formally written down. The Brotherhood became a museum that forgot it was supposed to be a library. The collection grew. The doors stayed sealed. The original purpose of all that careful cataloguing slowly became indistinguishable from the act of cataloguing itself. The recycled air moves steadily through the lower corridors, carrying nothing, disturbing nothing, passing through rooms that have not changed in decades. Among the catalogued items in Lost Hills are pre-war energy weapons, laser pistols and plasma rifles, whose serial numbers do not match any known pre-war manufacturer's coding system. These numbers were assigned to items before their full histories had been established, and they were never corrected. They were filed under original designations and carried forward through generation after generation of scribe-copied inventory lists. The Brotherhood's most sacred archive contains items whose recorded identities were placeholders that simply outlasted the intention to replace them. The organization, built on the premise that nothing should be mislabeled, has, quietly, mislabeled some of its oldest possessions. The T-45 power armor stored at Lost Hills in those earliest records appears slightly different from the T-45 documented in later periods. A narrower chest plate, a slightly different helmet profile, proportions that shifted when the armor was studied and recreated by later craftspeople working from references rather than originals. Each successive recreation drifted slightly further from the original frame. The power armor recognized across the wasteland as the Brotherhood's most iconic equipment is, in its current form, a copy of a copy. In the wasteland, most things that endure do so by drifting slowly from what they were, without ever quite admitting it. Before that power armor existed, Maxon's soldiers wore something that has never been seen. Terminal entries at Lost Hills reference a transitional period, the first 15 to 20 years after the bunker's establishment, when Brotherhood warriors went into the field wearing layered leather and metal composites that scribes had assembled from salvage lists. These composite suits were referenced in documents, mentioned in early records, noted in a terminal entry that was later removed from accessible archives. They were never preserved beyond the words that described them. The organization built to ensure nothing worth preserving would be lost its own first protective shell. The archive holds the record of that loss. It does not hold the thing itself. Inside this bunker, in the rooms where the first scribes set down their tools and began building something that would outlast them, one device kept returning. The Pip-Boy, the wrist-mounted computer carried by those who moved through the wasteland, was not a Brotherhood invention, but Lost Hills played a specific role in its preservation. Scribe records reference a cache of Pip-Boy 2000 units brought in during the march from Mariposa, several of which were disassembled for study. The Brotherhood's medical scribes used the Pip-Boy's biometric monitoring systems as a design reference for the medical equipment developed in the bunker's early decades. The device that became standard equipment for wasteland travelers, that small glowing screen on the left wrist, was partially reverse-engineered inside the first room the Brotherhood ever called home. It began here. Every version of it that exists in the wasteland carries, somewhere in its design, a trace of work done in this bunker by scribes who were trying to understand something they had been handed and had not yet named. In the silence beneath Lost Hills, 200 years of decisions still echo off the steel walls. The first question the Brotherhood ever asked itself has still not been answered. The bunker holds everything it was given. The doors remain closed. And somewhere in the lower levels, in a room where the light has been steady for longer than most people have been alive, a scribe is copying something that was written before they were born, so that it will survive them too. The path rises now, back toward the surface, and then northeast toward the place the Brotherhood came from before it came here, toward the wound that made all of this necessary. From the silence beneath Lost Hills, the path rises and moves northeast through the dry California landscape, past scrub and broken asphalt, past the long shadows of hills that have not changed since before the war. The bunker falls behind. What lies ahead is older and harder and closer to the beginning of everything. Mariposa Military Base does not announce itself. It sits in the earth the way a wound sits in the body, not on the surface, but present in everything around it. The air here is different from Lost Hills. It carries something heavier. The walls of this facility were not built for ceremony or preservation. They were built for containment. And what was contained here, what was designed, tested, and ultimately released into the wasteland from this location, reshaped every living thing that came after it. Mariposa Military Base was a pre-war United States Army installation that had been converted, without public knowledge, into a research facility for the Forced Evolutionary Virus, or FEV, a biological agent designed to rewrite the human body at the cellular level. The soldiers stationed here were told they were guarding a chemical weapons depot. The scientists working in the lower levels were told they were contributing to a national defense project. Neither group was told the full truth. Terminal entries recovered from the base's lower levels reveal that the project's actual goal, the weaponization of FEV as a population control mechanism, was classified above the clearance level of almost everyone physically present at the facility. The people building the weapon did not know what they were building. That specific structure of compartmentalized ignorance, workers kept deliberately uninformed of the purpose of their own labor, reappears in almost every Vault-Tec experiment that followed in the decades after the war. Mariposa was not the last place this was done. It was the place that proved it could be done. Pale light filters through the cracked panels of the upper levels, falling across floors that have not been cleaned since the last soldiers abandoned their posts. When Roger Maxson accessed the personal terminal logs of the lead scientists at Mariposa, he did not find monsters. He found people who were frightened. They had been writing private entries for months, careful, quiet entries about ethical objections they were not permitted to raise in official channels, about requests to be reassigned that were denied, about threats made against the safety of their families if they refused to continue. Several of those entries were later preserved in Brotherhood archives at Lost Hills, labeled by scribes as the original testimony. These documents are referenced in records connected to Elder Maxson's descendants, who speak of them not as evidence of wrongdoing, but as founding texts, the documents that explained why the Brotherhood had to exist. The Brotherhood of Steel was not founded on a military victory. It was founded on the reading of someone else's private grief. That grief was filed, preserved, and copied by hand, generation after generation, by scribes who may never have been told what it cost the people who first wrote it down. Those people, the scientists who wrote in private and continued working anyway, did not survive Mariposa unchanged. When those who later explored the ruins of this facility moved through its corridors, they encountered supermutants who had taken control of the structure, beings who were, at some earlier point, human beings subjected to FEV immersion in the very vats the scientists had built. The records do not indicate whether any of those beings had once been the scientists themselves. It is not impossible. The FEV transformation destroys most memories and most of what constitutes individual personality. The beings walking these corridors may carry, at the cellular level, the DNA of the people who wrote those private terminal entries. No record flags any supermutant at Mariposa with a pre-war identity. The question was left open in the surviving documentation, possibly by oversight, possibly by a deliberate choice not to answer what could not be answered cleanly. The ruins of Mariposa hold that question in every room, in every corridor, in every figure moving through the dark. Broken glass from a shattered observation window remains scattered across the sublevel floor, undisturbed, the edges still sharp after 200 years of sealed silence. The physical layout of Mariposa has not remained consistent across all records of the facility. In the earliest documentation of the base, the FEV vats are located in a deep sublevel accessible through a series of guarded corridors. In later records, describing the ruins of the same facility visited decades afterward, the VAT sublevel is in a different relative position, and the guard station corridors have been rearranged in ways that do not align with the original layout. Those responsible for producing the later records acknowledged that the ruins were documented from a new survey rather than from the original schematics, and spatial accuracy was not the stated priority. The result is that the most historically significant location in Brotherhood lore exists in two slightly different versions, and neither has been officially designated as more accurate than the other. What Mariposa actually looked like, the exact shape of the place where everything began, is itself a matter of conflicting records. The Brotherhood, which built its identity on the precision of its archive, cannot fully agree on the floor plan of its own origin point. After Roger Maxson led his soldiers away from Mariposa toward Lost Hills, the base was not destroyed. It was not sealed. It was simply left. In the years that followed, Brotherhood scouting parties returned to the facility on 3 separate occasions. Each time, the scouts found the FEV vats still operational. Residual power from the base's nuclear generator had kept the vats running without interruption. The Brotherhood's official response to each report was identical. The information was filed, and no action was taken. The vats that would eventually produce the supermutant army were allowed to remain active for decades after the Brotherhood had both the knowledge and the capability to shut them down. The Brotherhood classified the problem. It did not solve it. There is a specific kind of institutional failure that does not look like failure from the inside. It looks like patience, like ongoing assessment, like a matter still under review. Mariposa remained under review for long enough that what was reviewed inside it became something the Brotherhood then had to fight. The deep hum of the base's remaining generator carries through the lower walls, a sound that has continued without interruption since before the bombs fell. The super mutant army that emerged from those vats, the force that served as the primary threat across the California wasteland in the years following the war, was built using the Mariposa facility that Brotherhood scouts had documented and Brotherhood elders had declined to disable. When the Brotherhood finally mobilized against that army, their military planners used their own filed scout reports as intelligence briefings, reports that had been written, reviewed, and set aside years earlier. A terminal entry from Lost Hills, connected to the records of that period, notes that the army being engaged had grown in a facility that was known. The entry does not express regret. It contains a request for additional ammunition requisitions. The Brotherhood's relationship to its own failures has always been administrative. The language of the report does not change based on the size of the failure it is describing. Loss is noted. Armor is prioritized. The filing continues. That administrative language appears throughout the Brotherhood's military records from the Mariposa period. One recovered entry describes the loss of 3 paladins to supermutant ambush, followed immediately, in the same document, in the same measured tone, by a paragraph addressing acceptable moisture levels for power armor storage. The tonal shift is not comic in intent. It reflects a genuine military report format in which operational losses and equipment maintenance are treated as equally procedural concerns. The effect, when read across multiple such entries, is a portrait of an institution that processes everything through the same channel: grief, equipment, failure, inventory, because it has decided that the channel itself is what holds the institution together. The dead are noted. The armor is maintained. The Brotherhood remains functional. Whether this represents discipline or a specific kind of damage is a question the Brotherhood's own records do not ask. Among the recovery logs from Mariposa is an entry referencing a pre-war item found in the base commander's personal quarters, a holotape recording of a song. The song is identified in the log only as a pre-war popular music recording, civilian, non-military. No title is given. The scribe who logged it noted that the item was inappropriate for inclusion in the archive and marked it for disposal. No corresponding holotape item appears in any subsequent record. The song was documented, judged, and removed. The Brotherhood's archive contains the record of its own act of erasure, a file that describes a thing that no longer exists, preserved in careful handwriting, so that the act of removing it would not itself be lost. The archive remembered the deletion. It did not keep what was deleted. Within these corridors, in the barracks areas and the guard stations and the maintenance rooms, the soldiers who came before Maxon left other things behind. Those soldiers had been living at Mariposa under extended information blackout. No outside communication, no leave, no contact with family for the duration of their assignment. Scattered across the residential areas of the facility are personal items that have no function beyond their existence. Photographs pinned to bunks, a child's drawing found in the barracks, a coffee mug bearing the logo of a civilian sports team. None of these items were ever referenced in official records. None were catalogued. They exist as the only testimony of people who were stationed at a facility whose purpose they did not know, doing work whose consequences they could not have imagined, waiting for a leave rotation that never came. The soldiers who guarded Mariposa had lives that extended beyond the base. The base does not remember this. The objects they left behind do. Roger Maxon carried one of those objects with him when he led the march to Lost Hills. Not a weapon, not a document, not a piece of equipment from the facility. A printed photograph of his son, Maxon II, who had not been present at the base. Maxon II would later join his father at Lost Hills and become part of the Brotherhood's second generation. The photograph itself was never preserved in any accessible form, but its existence is noted in archive documents connected to the early Brotherhood period, and the presence of Maxon II in the founding generation is the direct reason the Brotherhood developed its family unit structure in those early years. Soldiers, who were also parents, building a bunker that was meant to hold both roles at once. Every institution that has ever lasted was built by people who were trying to protect something specific. For Roger Maxson, walking away from the facility that had already ended one world, the specific thing was a photograph, a face, a son who was waiting somewhere he had not yet reached. Mariposa does not ask for judgment. It simply remains, its lower levels still holding the weight of what was built here, its vats still carrying the memory of what they produced, and the long silence of what was found, and documented, and filed, and never undone. From here, the path follows the old trading routes south and east, toward a city built on exchange rather than isolation, where the Brotherhood first stepped into the open, and where the first outpost was built not underground, but in plain sight. From the ruins of Mariposa, the old trading routes lead south and east through the dry California landscape, past broken highway markers, past the long flat stretches where Brahmin caravans have worn new paths into the cracked earth. The weight of the base falls behind slowly. What lies ahead is louder and busier and built entirely on the premise that people can be trusted to trade without being watched. That premise was never one the Brotherhood accepted. The hub is the largest trading settlement in Southern California, a city built on commerce, on the movement of goods between communities that have no other reliable connection to each other. The smell of Brahmin and dust and cook fires reaches the outer districts before the buildings do. The noise of merchants and caravan drivers and water traders fills the streets from morning until well after dark. The hub is, by the standards of the post-war wasteland, alive in a way that most places are not. And somewhere inside it, above a trading floor that most people walk through without looking up, behind a door that carries no marking and draws no attention, the Brotherhood of Steel has been watching all of it. The Brotherhood outpost in the hub was not established for trade. It was established for intelligence collection. Records connected to the outpost describe it as a passive observation station, a position from which Brotherhood agents could monitor caravan traffic, track the movement of pre-war technology through hub trade networks, and identify items worth acquiring before those items disappeared into the hands of merchants who would not know what they had. The agents stationed at the outpost were dressed in civilian clothing, not power armor. They carried no Brotherhood markings. For most of the hub's population, the outpost did not exist. The Brotherhood's most effective collection tool in Southern California was a room above a trading post that nobody looked at twice. The most powerful military organization in the region had made itself invisible inside the noisiest city in the wasteland, and the noise was the cover. Faded cloth awnings hang over the market stalls below, their colors bleached by years of California sun, moving slightly in a dry wind that carries the dust of the road in from the east. Among the items Brotherhood agents were specifically tasked with tracking in the hub were medical technologies, pre-war pharmaceutical synthesis equipment, and any functioning autodoc units that had entered the trade network. Brotherhood medical scribes at Lost Hills had been attempting to reverse engineer autodoc surgery protocols since the bunker was first established, and functional units were rare enough that the Brotherhood classified them as strategic resources rather than medical equipment. Within the hub's water merchants district, a functional autodoc unit was present and accessible during the period of active Brotherhood observation. Brotherhood records never referenced this unit in any official action report. The agents knew it was there. They did not move on it. They watched it, filed its location, and continued monitoring. The Brotherhood has always preferred to watch before it takes. That patience is not always a virtue. Sometimes it is simply the habit of an organization that has learned to treat everything as something that might be more useful later. That same caution extended to the bodies of Brotherhood soldiers operating in the hub area. Field medical protocols issued to paladins on hub area assignment did not permit seeking outside medical assistance under any circumstances. A paladin who was injured and could not return to Lost Hills was directed to use their Pip-Boy's onboard medical guide and their personal Stimpack ration, and to wait. The protocol explicitly prohibited entering civilian medical facilities, receiving treatment from non-Brotherhood personnel, or allowing outsiders to observe their injuries in any condition. The concern was not infection or contamination, it was information. The nature of a soldier's wounds, their location, their depth, the type of damage that caused them, could reveal the kind of mission the soldier had been on, the quality of the armor they had been wearing, and the capabilities of whatever they had encountered. A Brotherhood soldier's injuries were classified material. Their pain was a security consideration. The boundary between the soldier's body and the Brotherhood's secrets did not stop at the armor. Within this outpost, in the quiet room above the trading floor, the files accumulated. Caravan logs, item sightings, patrol reports, each one a small piece of a picture the Brotherhood was building in silence. When a Brotherhood soldier died in the field during hub area operations, standard recovery protocol required a team to retrieve not the body, but the armor and the Pip-Boy. The body was designated a secondary priority. Terminal entries from Lost Hills, connected to the hub patrol era, include 3 separate recovery reports, each documenting the successful retrieval of equipment from a fallen paladin. In 2 of those reports, the body was also recovered. In 1, it was not. The report notes only that the location was deemed non-recoverable. The paladin's name appears in the document. It occupies 4 words of a 70-word report. The armor is described across 6 full sentences: its condition, its damage pattern, its salvageable components. The Brotherhood's recovery protocol was designed to preserve what the Brotherhood had built. The paladin who had worn the armor was noted. The armor was prioritized. These are not the same thing, and the reports do not suggest that anyone considered them to be. Field repairs to that armor were permitted under specific conditions. Hub area paladins were authorized to purchase civilian materials through approved channels for power armor maintenance, certain grades of scrap metal, industrial adhesives, hydraulic fluid available through hub trade networks. These purchases were conducted through civilian intermediaries, so that no Brotherhood personnel would need to appear openly in hub markets. The intermediaries were paid in pre-war coins, a currency rare enough that hub merchants who received them tended to remember the transactions. Several merchants in the hub reference well paying anonymous clients in their records, clients who purchased specific industrial materials in specific quantities and left without identifying themselves. They were describing armor repair procurement runs conducted on behalf of the Brotherhood's hidden outpost. The Brotherhood was buying what it needed to maintain itself from the same city it was covertly monitoring through people who did not know who they were working for. The sound of the market carries up through the floor of the outpost, the steady low noise of a city that does not know it is being observed. One of the figures who moved through the hub during the outpost's active period was intended, in the original design of the facility, to serve as the Brotherhood's primary civilian contact, the person through whom the agents moved money, materials, and occasionally information. This individual appears in the hub's records with inventory and dialogue flags that, in the underlying data, include variables connected to Brotherhood-related transactions. In the final version of those records, no such connection is visible. The Brotherhood dialogue was removed before the records were completed. What remains is a merchant with standard trade interactions, and no visible connection to the outpost above them, a character whose original purpose was cut and whose data flags were left behind as the only evidence of what they were supposed to be. The Brotherhood's civilian network in the hub was built into the design of the city and then removed before anyone could find it. The outpost retained its function. Its most important relationship became invisible. Beyond technology and equipment, the outpost's agents were also tasked with watching people. Brotherhood recruiters operating through the hub were directed to identify potential initiates among the city's population. The recruitment criteria preserved in Lost Hills records include physical health, demonstrated technical aptitude, and absence of significant familial obligation. That final criterion was the most specific. The Brotherhood was looking for people who would not be missed, individuals without close family connections, without deep community ties, without anyone who would ask questions about where they had gone. The hub's most connected citizens were not of interest. The ones the Brotherhood watched most carefully were the ones who were already alone. The organization that began as a family unit, soldiers and their families, sealed together in a bunker, built its growth on people who had no family structure left to seal themselves away from. The Brotherhood recruited its future from the wasteland's most isolated residents. One of those recruits went through the full initiation process at Lost Hills, and then, within their first year, requested to return to the hub. The request was denied. A second request followed 6 months later and was denied again. A third request, submitted 18 months into service, was followed shortly afterward by the recruit's disappearance from the bunker. The Brotherhood's recovery protocol was initiated. The individual was never found. The file closes with a standard administrative notation: status, absent without authorization, equipment, unrecovered. No name appears in the accessible version of the record. The Brotherhood's files are precise about what was lost and silent about who was lost. The missing equipment is noted in detail. The missing person is a status line. The Brotherhood's official position on members who left without authorization was that such individuals were security liabilities, people whose knowledge of Brotherhood locations, protocols, and technology made them subjects for recovery rather than punishment. Lost Hills' administrative records are clear on this point. Deserters were not to be harmed. They were to be found, debriefed, and returned. The return protocol is not described in further detail in any available record. The outcome for those who left is similarly unrecorded. The former Brotherhood members who appear in hub records and surrounding area accounts are not described as living freely. They are simply absent. The Brotherhood's promise of non-harm is documented. Its consequences are not. The archive holds the policy. It does not hold what the policy produced. The hub's civilian population, for its part, holds a belief about the Brotherhood that appears consistently across the accounts of merchants, caravan drivers, and water traders. A belief that the Brotherhood is much smaller than it actually is. A small group of soldiers up in the hills, as several accounts describe it. A band of well-armed survivalists, not a significant force. The Brotherhood's information control had worked with such precision that the people living closest to Lost Hills had the least accurate understanding of what was operating near them. The outpost above the trading floor had done its work entirely. The city below it knew almost nothing. The Brotherhood had mastered the most important capability in the post-war wasteland, not firepower, not technology, not numbers. The ability to be underestimated. An organization that is believed to be small and isolated can move through the world with a freedom that power, openly displayed, cannot buy. The hub moves on. Caravans load in the early morning light. Merchants argue over weights and measures. The smell of Brahmin and dust settles over the market stalls. Somewhere above the trading floor, a door that carries no marking closes quietly. The Brotherhood continues to watch. It has always been watching. And in the wasteland, the things that watch without being seen tend to outlast the things that are seen without watching. The path moves north now, following routes that will grow quieter as the California landscape opens into harder country, toward a place where the Brotherhood's West Coast story begins to come apart at the edges, and where something older and darker left its shadow on the ground. From the hub's noise and dust and commerce, the path moves north through California's quieter country, past the trading routes, past the last Brahmin trails, into territory where the settlements grow sparse and the hills flatten into long stretches of dry grass and broken road. The further north the path goes, the less the wasteland resembles the world the Brotherhood built itself to protect. Out here, the sky is wide, and the distance between one thing and another is measured in silence. Navarro sits at the edge of that silence. It does not advertise itself. It was never meant to. The Enclave's mainland fuel depot and vertibird base is not a place that welcomes observation. Its perimeter is maintained. Its personnel are trained. Its aircraft come and go on schedules that are not filed in any public record. The Northern California air here carries the smell of fuel and cold fog rolling in from the coast, and the sound of vertibird rotors somewhere above the cloud line, present before visible, gone before fully identified. It is not a comfortable place to watch from. The Brotherhood watched it anyway. The Enclave, the remnants of the pre-war United States government, operating from a secured oil rig off the California coast, and the Brotherhood of Steel spent the Fallout 2 era in a state of cold, deliberate non-engagement. Neither side moved against the other openly. Brotherhood records from this period describe a strategic assessment that reached a specific conclusion. The Enclave's military technology, their advanced power armor, their vertibird aircraft, their ongoing FEV research, exceeded what the Brotherhood could contest directly with its current resources. The choice was not made from fear. It was made from calculation. Observation was selected over engagement because observation was survivable and engagement was not. The Brotherhood watched the Enclave the same way it had watched the Hub, from a distance, with patience, with files accumulating in a location the subject of those files did not know existed. The Cold War between the Wasteland's two most technologically advanced organizations was fought entirely in notebooks, and the Brotherhood was the only side that knew it was happening. Fog moves through the tree line at the edge of the Navarro perimeter, slow and low, settling into the spaces between the pines without disturbing them. The Brotherhood scouts monitoring Navarro produced a series of technical reports on Enclave vertibird performance, documents covering speed, operational range, payload capacity, maintenance requirements, fuel consumption, and crew complement. These reports were filed at Lost Hills and used by Brotherhood engineers as the foundational data for their own vertibird acquisition program. The vertibirds that would eventually fly over the capital wasteland in a later era of Brotherhood operations were not built from original designs. They were reverse engineered from captured Enclave units. But the knowledge that made that reverse engineering possible, the baseline understanding of how a vertibird worked, what it needed, what it could do, was gathered at Navarro by scouts who watched from the tree line and wrote everything down. The most visible symbol of the East Coast Brotherhood's military power traces its origin to a hillside in Northern California, where a soldier watched the sky and took careful notes. The Brotherhood did not build that capability. It collected it, filed it, and waited for the right moment to use what it had learned. That patience was tested at least once. Brotherhood intelligence reports from the Navarro observation period include an entry describing a situation in which a scout team found itself in position to acquire an Enclave vertibird from an unguarded landing pad. The aircraft was accessible. The pad was unattended. The window was real. The team commander made the independent decision not to proceed. The explanation recorded in the report was precise. The acquisition would have revealed the existence and location of the Brotherhood observation post, and the intelligence value of continued undetected surveillance outweighed the value of a single aircraft. The Lost Hills Elder Council reviewed the report and officially commended the decision. The Brotherhood passed on a vertibird to keep watching. The commendation was filed. The vertibird was left on the pad. The file describing this decision reads less like a record of tactical restraint and more like a statement of institutional philosophy. That the act of watching, maintained long enough, is worth more than any single thing the watching might allow you to take. Inside the observation posts the Brotherhood maintained along the Navarro perimeter, the files grew thicker through every season, reports layered on reports, each one a small addition to a picture being built over years. Not far from Navarro, in the northeastern California landscape, a small tribal village called Arroyo existed during the same period. The community was recorded in Brotherhood regional survey documents under the general heading of Tribal Settlements, Northeastern California, part of an ongoing Brotherhood effort to map all surviving human communities within their operational area. Arroyo was classified as small, low technology, and low threat. It was assigned the Brotherhood's lowest monitoring priority. No dedicated file was opened for it. The village that produced the chosen one, the individual who would travel the wasteland, recover the Gek or Garden of Eden creation kit, and ultimately bring about the destruction of the Enclave, was, in Brotherhood records, a footnote, a dot on a population map. The organization that prided itself on the completeness of its surveillance had assigned its lowest level of attention to the community that would do what the Brotherhood, with all its patience and all its files, had not yet done. The wasteland has a consistent habit of producing its most significant developments in places that nobody was watching closely. By the time the events of the Fallout 2 era were unfolding, the West Coast Brotherhood itself had entered what its own internal records describe as a period of consolidation. Recruitment had slowed. Several outlying outposts had been quietly abandoned rather than maintained or replaced. The Brotherhood that had once been the most feared military force in Southern California had spent so long hoarding, observing, and assessing that it had gradually contracted, not through defeat, not through catastrophe, but through the slow, quiet consequence of choosing preservation over growth for too long. The organization was not broken. It was simply smaller than the world it had been built to protect, and the gap between those two things had been growing for years without anyone filing a report about it. The wind moves through the dry grass along the Navarro perimeter, carrying nothing, going nowhere in particular, the way wind does in places where human plans have already run their course. It was partly that contraction, that sense of a chapter reaching its natural limits, that contributed to the departure of the expedition that would eventually become the Midwestern Brotherhood. The group that left Lost Hills for the Midwest was tasked with recovering technology from the central conflict zones of the Great War, specifically the Chicago region and the surrounding areas. Contact with Lost Hills was lost during the expedition. The group that arrived in the Midwest became, over time, a self-sustaining Brotherhood chapter, operating under its own developing doctrine. In Fallout Tactics, that chapter recruits non-humans and outsiders, ghouls, super mutants, beings that the West Coast Brotherhood had explicitly prohibited from membership. The same order, separated from its origin point and grown in different conditions, had become something its founders would not have fully recognized. Institutions that lose contact with their center do not always drift. Sometimes they become something deliberately different. The West Coast Brotherhood's official response to that difference was neither endorsement nor condemnation. The Lost Hills Elder Council resolution, documented in connection with the Midwestern chapter's activities, designated the expedition members as operating under field authority until contact could be re-established. That status, temporary by definition, was never formally updated. The Midwestern Brotherhood was still operating under field authority when Fallout Tactics takes place, a temporary designation that had outlasted everyone who originally issued it. The Brotherhood resolved its most significant internal contradiction the same way it resolved most difficult questions, by filing it under a category that allowed the filing to substitute for a decision and waiting for circumstances to change. The circumstances never changed. The file remained open. The field authority designation became, over time, indistinguishable from permanent independence. The command structure that developed in the Midwest reflects that independence precisely. The Midwestern Brotherhood in Fallout Tactics operates under a general, a rank that does not exist anywhere in the West Coast Brotherhood's hierarchy, which is organized around elder councils. The choice of a general's title was deliberate. The Midwest chapter had chosen to maintain the language of the pre-war United States Army rather than the quasi-medieval structure Roger Maxson had invented at Lost Hills. Elder versus general. Council versus command. The distinction is not merely semantic. It reflects two different answers to the same foundational question about what the Brotherhood was supposed to be. The West Coast had built a new institution with new traditions and new language. The Midwest had tried to remain what it originally was. Both choices produced functional organizations. Neither produced the other. Within the Midwestern chapter, That openness to outsiders did not go uncontested. Cut records from the period include dialogue lines in which Brotherhood officers argued at length about the recruitment of non-human members. Lines suggesting that the debate was ongoing and unresolved well into the period Fallout Tactics depicts. The Midwestern Brotherhood had opened its doors. The argument about whether those doors should have been opened continued behind them. An institution can change its policy without changing the minds of the people who disagree with it. The records of that disagreement were removed from the final accessible files. The disagreement itself was not removed. It simply became internal. When the Enclave's oil rig fell and the Navarro base was abandoned in the aftermath of the Fallout 2 era's final events, the Brotherhood moved. After-action records connected to the transition period describe a recovery operation in the Navarro area, a systematic retrieval of Enclave military hardware left behind when the base was abandoned. Among the items recovered, 3 sets of advanced power armor Mark II, the most advanced personal protection technology the pre-war government had ever produced. These suits are referenced in later Brotherhood records from the capital wasteland as California acquisitions, items brought east as part of the technology base the Brotherhood carried with it when it expanded beyond its West Coast origins. The Brotherhood had watched Navarro for years, filing reports, commending restraint, passing on opportunities to take what it was watching. When the watching was finally over, it moved through the empty base with the efficiency of an organization that had been planning exactly this for a long time. Navarro's landing pads are empty now. The vertibirds are gone. The Enclave's fires are out. Somewhere along the tree line, the last Brotherhood scout closes the last notebook from the last observation rotation and begins the long walk east, carrying everything the Brotherhood learned here, toward a continent that does not yet know it is coming. The path goes north and inland from here, away from the California coast, into territory that grows colder and flatter and further from anything the West Coast Brotherhood would recognize as its own. Into the Midwest, into the ruins of Chicago, into the place where the expedition that left Lost Hills became something it had not been sent out to become. From the California coast and the cold silence of Navarro, the path moves inland and north, through the flat country, through the wide open stretches of what was once the American heartland, through ruins that carry a different quality of emptiness than the California wasteland. The West Coast wasteland feels like something that dried out. The Midwest feels like something that was simply left behind, wide, flat, and very quiet, with a cold that settles into the bones of every structure still standing. Chicago does not greet arrivals. It simply exists, in the state it has existed in for 200 years. Broken towers, collapsed bridges, streets that have been reclaimed so slowly by grass and debris that the original grid is still visible from above, like a pattern the earth has not yet finished erasing. Bunker Alpha sits within that landscape, not far from where the city's outer districts used to begin. It does not look like something the Brotherhood built. That is because it is not. Bunker Alpha is a repurposed, pre-war military installation, a facility that was designed, built, and partially operated before the war by a branch of the United States Army, and that the Midwestern Brotherhood inherited rather than constructed. This distinguishes it immediately from Lost Hills, which was carved out and shaped over generations by people who intended it to be exactly what it became. Bunker Alpha was designed for purposes that no longer exist, to house equipment that has not been present for 2 centuries, to serve a military organization that ceased to exist before the Brotherhood arrived. Several rooms within the facility are used for storage, not because storage was their intended function, but because their original function left them with no obvious Brotherhood application. The Midwestern Brotherhood has been living in someone else's building for decades. The building has not forgotten its original owners. Neither has the Brotherhood fully replaced them. Cold grey light filters through the ventilation slats near the bunker's upper level, the kind of flat Midwest light that does not cast strong shadows, that makes everything visible without making anything warm. The walls of Bunker Alpha retain pre-war United States Army markings that the Midwestern Brotherhood has never removed. unit designations, safety notices, emergency procedure signs printed or stenciled in formats that belong to a military that no longer exists. Several of those unit designations reference the 101st Airborne Division, one of the most decorated and historically significant units in American military history. A unit that fought in the Second World War, that was present at some of the most consequential moments in 20th century conflict, that carried a name recognized by anyone who had studied that history. Brotherhood members in Fallout Tactics move past these markings daily. There is no record of any member acknowledging what they reference. The 101st Airborne's designation is visible on the walls of a facility that now houses a post-war military order that has never heard of them. The Midwestern Brotherhood has been living inside a memorial without knowing it, walking past the names of the dead without being told what those names meant. What the Brotherhood chose to display alongside those inherited markings reflects a very different institutional identity from the one that developed at Lost Hills. Where Lost Hills features Brotherhood seals, oaths carved into metal, and ceremonial arrangements of recovered technology presented as objects of significance, Bunker Alpha features operational maps, weapons racks, mission briefing boards, and the personal commendations of individual soldiers displayed alongside unit citations. The aesthetic is closer to a functioning military base than to a nightly orders hall. The difference is not accidental. It reflects a chapter that chose to preserve the language and visual culture of the pre-war army rather than adopt the new traditions Roger Maxson had invented. The production of a room, the choices made about what to hang on its walls and what to leave bare, communicates institutional character more precisely than most formal documents. Bunker Alpha's walls say that the people who live here consider themselves soldiers first and members of an order second. Lost Hills' walls say the opposite. Within these corridors, the Brotherhood that chose to stay military has developed structures that exist nowhere else in the Order's documented history. Among those structures is a rank designation that appears in the Midwestern Brotherhood's progression records and has never been referenced in any other Brotherhood context: the Initiate Specialist. This rank sits between the Standard Initiate designation and the Knight designation, and was developed to account for soldiers who had completed field training but had not yet demonstrated the level of independent tactical judgment the Midwestern chapter required before conferring Knight status. No corresponding rank appears in West Coast Brotherhood records. No later Fallout title has acknowledged or retconned its existence. The Initiate Specialist designation exists in the Midwestern Brotherhood's records as a rank that was created once, used in one specific context, and then passed into the broader Brotherhood canon without ever being addressed again. It remains there, technically real, technically unchallenged, mentioned exactly once across the entire recorded history of the Brotherhood of Steel, by a chapter that no longer appears in the active record. The same chapter developed its most distinctive and least examined policy in the area of recruitment. The Midwestern Brotherhood's practice of accepting non-human members, ghouls, super mutants, and eventually deathclaws, was supported by in-universe reasoning. The chapter needed numbers. The threats it faced required capabilities that human soldiers alone could not always provide, and its decades of isolation from West Coast doctrine had created philosophical room for decisions that Lost Hills would never have considered. But the specific mechanics of that acceptance, the process by which a Deathclaw would be inducted into the Brotherhood, the oath it would take, the rank it would hold, the way it would be integrated into a command structure built for human soldiers, were never defined in any available record. The policy existed. Its implementation details did not. The Brotherhood's most unusual recruitment decision was also its least documented one. The Midwestern chapter opened a door it had never described in writing. The hum of Bunker Alpha's heating system moves through the walls at a low, constant frequency, the sound of a building working to maintain a temperature the Midwest winter consistently argues against. What happened to those non-human members after the Midwestern chapter's active period ended is not recorded in any subsequent Fallout source. The Brotherhood's Chicago chapter, its general, its non-human recruits, its distinctive command structure, simply disappears from the record when the events of the Fallout Tactics era conclude. Later records acknowledging the existence of multiple Brotherhood chapters do not address Chicago specifically. The ghouls and super mutants who served the Midwestern Brotherhood were present, were documented, were part of a functioning military organization, and then the record stops. No retirement, no disbanding, no formal reassignment. The Midwest chapter's story ends mid-sentence, in the middle of a word that was never finished. The Brotherhood's most unusual chapter is also the one with the least resolved ending. What was built in Chicago in the years after the expedition lost contact with Lost Hills exists in the record as an incomplete file, open, unanswered, and filed under a category the broader Brotherhood has never returned to close. The broader Brotherhood's relationship to the Midwestern chapter reflects the same unresolved quality. Fallout Tactics is the only Fallout title in which the organization the player serves treats that player as expendable from the beginning, outsider recruited, outside the Inner Order's full trust, present in Brotherhood armor, without being fully Brotherhood in the way that the institution defines membership. The tension between wearing the uniform and belonging to the institution is the Midwestern chapter's defining characteristic, and it is present in every level of how the chapter is depicted. The armor is available, the trust is not. In all other Fallout titles, the Brotherhood is approachable as an ally, a neutral party, or an antagonist in specific contexts, but never as an institution that wears its own distrust of its members as openly as the Midwest chapter wears it. It is the Brotherhood at its most honestly hierarchical, which means it is the Brotherhood at its most uncomfortable. Among Bunker Alpha's non-human members, the balance of capability shifted in ways the chapter's leadership did not fully anticipate. Non-human companions within the Midwestern Brotherhood's operational records have attribute progressions that exceed what is achievable for human members in comparable roles, physical capabilities that reflect the biological realities of non-human physiology rather than any institutional favoritism. The result is a documented imbalance in which the Brotherhood's least traditionally canonical members became its most physically effective ones in several operational categories. The Deathclaw, by the measures the Midwestern Brotherhood used to assess its soldiers, was better at being Brotherhood than most of its Brotherhood members. The institution that built itself on the preservation of human capability had, in its most isolated chapter, produced its most capable non-human soldiers. That outcome was acknowledged. Its implications were not discussed in any accessible record. The armory that houses Bunker Alpha's heaviest equipment became accessible earlier in the chapter's operational timeline than the records suggest was intended, a consequence of the facility's layout having been revised during the period of the Brotherhood's establishment, with the armory's contents not adjusted to match the revised access points. The result was that the most powerful weapons in the facility were available to personnel who had not yet reached the experience level the original layout had been designed to require. The Brotherhood's most formidable room was accessible before the Brotherhood was ready for anyone to be in it. It was not a gift. It was a scheduling failure that no one corrected before it became standard access. In the deepest storage level of Bunker Alpha, a terminal contains inventory entries for items listed under the designation Archived, origin unverified. Among those entries is a reference to a pre-war document package described only as historical records, West Coast provenance, pre-expedition. It is the only suggestion in any accessible record that the Midwestern expedition carried documents from Lost Hills when it departed, documents that would predate the chapter's separation, that would contain founding Brotherhood records, possibly original copies of Maxon's early declarations and the founding library's first inventory. These documents are not accessible through any available channel. They are listed in a terminal that no formal record directs anyone to examine. Somewhere in Bunker Alpha's deepest storage, the Midwestern Brotherhood is holding the founding papers of an order they no longer fully resemble, carrying the origin of an institution they have quietly become a translation of, in a building that remembers a different uniform entirely. The lights in Bunker Alpha hum with the steady sound of pre-war wiring still carrying current. Current that has flowed through these walls since before the Brotherhood arrived, through circuits that were installed for a unit that no longer exists, in a facility that has outlasted everyone who ever had a reason to build it. In deep storage, old papers wait. The Brotherhood above them has almost forgotten who wrote them. The papers are patient. Papers always are. The path now crosses the continent, east, across the long flat miles, toward the coast, toward the ruins of a city that was once the capital of the country that built everything the Brotherhood was founded to preserve. Washington, D.C. A different Brotherhood chapter made a different choice there. They built their fortress inside the bones of the government that created the war. The Citadel is waiting. From the Midwest ruins and the cold silence of Bunker Alpha, the path crosses the continent eastward, through the long flat miles, through territory that grows more populated with ruin the closer it draws to the coast. The capital wasteland announces itself before it arrives. The sky above it carries a grey quality that is different from the grey of other regions, heavier, more settled, as though the radiation has become part of the atmosphere rather than a contamination of it. And rising from the Virginia side of the Potomac, visible from a distance that most structures in the wasteland cannot manage, is a shape that does not belong to any natural landscape. The Citadel does not look like something that was built after the war. It looks like something that survived it, which is precisely what it is. The Citadel in Fallout 3 is built into and around the ruins of the Pentagon, the pre-war United States Department of Defense headquarters in Arlington, Virginia. The Brotherhood of Steel chose this location deliberately. Elder Owen Lyons, who led the Capital Wasteland chapter, selected the Pentagon ruins specifically because the structure's reinforced concrete and steel construction had survived the nuclear exchange largely intact. A building designed to withstand catastrophic damage had done exactly that, and the Brotherhood recognized what that meant. But the symbolism was also intentional, as recorded in terminal entries within the facility itself. The Brotherhood saw themselves as the inheritors of pre-war military institutional knowledge, and occupying the Pentagon's ruins was an expression of that inheritance made physical. They did not search the wasteland for a suitable location. They moved into the home the old military had left behind, because no other location in the capital wasteland said more clearly what the Brotherhood believed about itself. The ruins of the Department of Defense became the headquarters of the organization that had decided it was the Department of Defense now. Pale light from the Virginia sky filters through the Citadel's upper observation points, falling in thin strips across floors of reinforced concrete that have not changed since before the war. When the Capital Wasteland Brotherhood first secured the Pentagon ruins, an event that predates the Fallout 3 era by several decades, their initial surveys found the structure partially occupied. Feral ghouls had taken the upper levels. Raider encampments had established themselves in several of the outer rings. The Brotherhood's clearing operation, documented in Citadel terminal entries, took several months and was conducted systematically, level by level, ring by ring, until the structure was fully under Brotherhood control. What those same records note, in a single line that most readers overlook, is that the clearing teams recovered several intact pre-war document caches in sealed sublevels during the operation. These caches were transferred to Scribe Division without being opened. Terminal entries written decades later reference document caches that have still not been fully catalogued. The Pentagon has been the Brotherhood's home for decades. They have not yet read everything inside it. The organization, built on the premise that no knowledge worth preserving should remain unexamined, has been living above an unexamined archive since the day it moved in. The most restricted portion of that archive sits in the Citadel's ring, the innermost section of the facility, accessible only to those who have established significant standing within the Brotherhood's hierarchy. Inside, Elder Lyons' personal terminal contains entries that reveal the depth of disagreement between the Capital Wasteland chapter and the West Coast Brotherhood leadership. Lyons had been redirecting Brotherhood resources toward protecting civilians in the wasteland, rather than strictly pursuing technology acquisition and isolation, a deviation from core Brotherhood doctrine significant enough that the West Coast elders issued a formal censure. One terminal entry in the A-ring contains Lyons' response to that censure. It is 3 sentences long. It does not apologize. It states that his interpretation of the Brotherhood's mission is correct, and that the West Coast's position has been noted. The Brotherhood's most internal archive holds a letter that amounts, in its quiet way, to the words "I heard you, and I disagree." The A-ring, the most protected room in the most fortified structure in the capital wasteland, contains at its center an act of institutional defiance filed in plain language and never withdrawn. The low hum of the Citadel's power systems carries through the A-ring's walls at all hours, a sound that does not change between day and night, because the Citadel does not observe the difference. That defiance had a specific shape. Project Purity, the effort to restore clean water to the capital wasteland by reactivating the Jefferson Memorial's water purification facility, was not a Brotherhood initiative. It was a civilian scientific project, led by a researcher named James, whose work Lyons chose to protect with Brotherhood military resources, because he believed access to clean water was a humanitarian necessity rather than a strategic asset. West Coast Brotherhood doctrine would have classified the Jefferson Memorial's purification technology as a recoverable resource to be secured and held, not activated for the general population. Lyons chose the population. The West Coast filed another censure. In the records of Fallout 3, the Brotherhood's commitment to Project Purity is presented as institutional policy, but it is the product of a decade-long internal argument that began in the A-ring and was never resolved through official channels. The Brotherhood's most publicly significant act in the capital wasteland was, in the West Coast's view, a violation of everything the Brotherhood was supposed to be doing. The most dramatic expression of that commitment was not a policy document. It was stored in the Citadel's B-ring for years in a non-functional state, a massive pre-war combat robot designated Liberty Prime. Brotherhood scribes had been working to restore it throughout Elder Lyons' tenure, and the restoration project is documented in over a dozen progress reports spanning more than a decade. Those reports chart gradual advances and repeated failures with the same measured tone used for every other Brotherhood filing. One entry reads simply, "Unit remains non-operational, team morale declining." Liberty Prime, the most visible weapon deployed in the defense of the capital wasteland, spent years as a failed engineering project that a tired team kept attempting to fix, in a basement room that most personnel walked past without stopping. Its eventual activation is not a dramatic revelation. It is the endpoint of years of unremarked labor by scribes whose names appear in progress reports that almost no one read. Liberty Prime's combat behavior, once activated, included a feature that became among the most recognized in the Capital Wasteland Brotherhood's operational history: the delivery of patriotic declarations while engaging enemies. Statements like democracy is non-negotiable and death is a preferable alternative to communism were broadcast at high volume during combat operations. What the records of this behavior do not initially suggest is that the frequency and randomness of those declarations was the result of an error in the audio delivery system rather than an intentional design. Each statement was originally intended to play once per engagement phase. Due to a trigger malfunction, statements could repeat, overlap, or deliver in rapid succession during intense combat. The decision was made to maintain the error rather than correct it, because the resulting delivery was judged more characterful than the original pattern. Liberty Prime's most recognized feature was preserved by accident, filed under acceptable performance rather than corrected to specification. The Citadel's own ambient sound carries a similar quality of authenticity. The constant low mechanical hum, the distant hydraulic sounds, the occasional metallic echo that moves through the corridors, these were constructed from recordings made in a functioning industrial facility, specifically a water treatment plant, chosen because the combination of pump sounds and pipe resonance matched the Brotherhood's particular combination of military hardware and underground infrastructure. The result is an ambient sound environment that those familiar with industrial work describe as unusually genuine. It feels real because it was recorded in a place that was doing real work, and mixed to suggest that the Citadel is, underneath all its military ceremony, a functioning machine that does not stop. Beneath the Citadel's main operational levels, that machine runs continuously. The lower levels of the Citadel contain power generation systems, water recycling infrastructure, and food production areas that exist as functional parts of the facility, rather than as spaces the Brotherhood's primary attention is directed toward. Personnel reference these systems in passing, a scribe noting a filtration check, a knight asking about generator rotation schedules, but no formal record addresses them as significant. The infrastructure that keeps several hundred people alive underground runs in the background of everything the Citadel does, unremarked upon, behind the line of institutional attention. The Brotherhood's fortress is also a life support system, and the life support system never stops running, even when no one is writing reports about it. The food those systems help sustain comes from sources that the Brotherhood's official doctrine would prefer not to acknowledge directly. Internal records categorize food procurement arrangements with nearby civilian settlements as necessary resource acquisitions rather than community engagement, a language choice that allows the Brotherhood to conduct trade with the outside world while formally maintaining that its policy of limited civilian contact is intact. The Brotherhood feeds itself through a relationship that its doctrine says should not exist, described in paperwork that reframes that relationship as something administratively acceptable. The gap between the Citadel's stated policy and its actual supply chain is bridged entirely by careful word choice. Institutions often survive by not examining their own contradictions too closely. The Brotherhood has elevated this practice to a filing system. One figure within the Citadel has been examining those contradictions for longer than most of its current residents have been alive. Scribe Rothschild, the Citadel's chief science officer, served in the Brotherhood before Elder Lyons arrived in the capital wasteland. His personal terminal entries, accessible in the laboratory, span decades and constitute the most complete single-person record of the capital wasteland Brotherhood's history that remains in any accessible form. They also contain, in entries from the middle decades of his service, a sustained series of observations about what he describes as the increasing confusion of military priorities with humanitarian ambitions. Rothschild disagreed with the direction Lyons had taken the chapter. He continued his work anyway. His terminal is the record of a person who spent decades doing work he believed in for an institution whose choices he had reservations about, which is, in the end, a record that describes most people who commit themselves to any organization that outlives their original certainty about it. The Brotherhood's most complete internal historian disagreed with the Brotherhood's most significant chapter. He filed his disagreement carefully. He stayed. The Citadel hums in the Virginia dark, its generators turning, its scribes reading, its paladins sleeping in rows, a machine for preserving something that the world outside has mostly stopped asking for. Still running, still guarding, still certain. Outside the Citadel's walls, the capital wasteland opens into a landscape that carries the specific quality of something that was once the most symbolically significant place in a nation, and is now the most symbolically significant ruin in a wasteland. The National Mall stretches between broken monuments. The Potomac reflects a sky the color of old concrete. The streets that were once lined with the institutions of democratic government are now the territory of Brotherhood patrols that move through them in power armor, past the Washington Monument's cracked obelisk, past the Lincoln Memorial's collapsed colonnade, past the Capitol building's dome that has been open to the weather for 200 years. The Brotherhood walks through all of it without stopping to read the names on the walls. Brotherhood patrol routes in the capital wasteland were not determined by tactical necessity alone. The routes were deliberately designed to pass near the Washington Monument, the Lincoln Memorial, and the Capitol building, the most symbolically loaded structures in the ruins. The intention, recorded in design notes connected to the Capital Wasteland Brotherhood's operational history, was that the Brotherhood's presence should feel like a military occupation of history itself, the armor of the present moving through the symbols of what the past believed about itself. No official Brotherhood document explains why patrol routes were drawn to include these specific landmarks. The intention was visual, not strategic, and it worked with enough precision that the Capital Wasteland Brotherhood is described more consistently in terms of atmosphere than any other version of the faction across the full Fallout record. The patrols did not create the ruins. They simply became inseparable from them. Irradiated dust moves along the base of the Washington Monument in the grey afternoon light, undisturbed by anything except the slow passage of armoured figures on their scheduled routes. What those patrols encountered in the DC ruins is recorded in Brotherhood casualty reports accessible in Citadel terminal entries, and the primary cause of field losses in the area is consistently listed as super mutants. The concentration of super mutants that had established control of the DC ruins before the Brotherhood's arrival was larger and better armed than initial assessments had anticipated. One casualty report notes that patrol teams encountered super mutant groups in the mall area carrying miniguns and rocket launchers, weapons salvaged from the same pre-war military supply depots that Brotherhood scouts had been monitoring for acquisition. The Brotherhood had not planned for the possibility that the super mutants would arm themselves from the same stockpiles the Brotherhood was trying to reach. Both organizations were, in functional terms, competing for the same pre-war caches. The Capital Wasteland's super mutant problem and its Brotherhood patrol problem were expressions of the same underlying conflict, filed under two different category headings. Among the weapons circulating in the DC ruins during the Brotherhood patrol era is one item that appears in the Wasteland's records without any corresponding Brotherhood documentation. The terrible shotgun, a weapon of unusual performance characteristics recovered in the Capital Wasteland, carries a designation suggesting pre-war civilian manufacture, but its recorded capabilities exceed those of standard pre-war combat weapons by a margin that is inconsistent with that designation. Its origin tag in the surviving records is listed as a placeholder notation from early in the documentation period, a label assigned before the item's history had been fully established, and never replaced with more specific information. Brotherhood patrol logs contain no reference to it. The most anomalous weapon in the Capital Wasteland passed through Brotherhood territory without generating a single filed report. The organization that catalogued everything somehow never catalogued this. That gap is not an isolated occurrence. The Brotherhood's weapons registry for the Capital Wasteland, documented in Citadel supply terminal entries, covers standard combat weapons, energy weapons, explosives, and pre-war military hardware with considerable thoroughness. What it formally excludes is a category the Brotherhood designated as civilian origin improvised weapons, a classification considered below the threshold of strategic value. In practice, this exclusion means the Brotherhood's registry fails to document the majority of weapons actually in circulation in the Capital Wasteland. The cobbled-together pipe rifles, the modified hunting weapons, the salvage-built firearms that most Wasteland residents actually carried, none of these were recorded. The Brotherhood catalogued what it considered worth cataloguing. The gap between its records and the actual armament of the region it was patrolling was the width of everything it had decided did not matter. The registry is extensive. It is also incomplete in ways the Brotherhood did not acknowledge as incompleteness. Just beyond the effective radius of regular Brotherhood patrol coverage, the Galaxy News radio broadcast tower rises above the Genera Plaza. Galaxy News Radio's broadcast tower stands at the center of a plaza that Brotherhood patrols pass through, but do not permanently hold. The decision not to station troops at the Genera building was deliberate, recorded in a Citadel terminal entry as a specific judgment made by Elder Lyons that Brotherhood presence at the Genera location would compromise the broadcaster's independence in ways that would damage the Brotherhood's relationship with Capital Wasteland's civilian communities more than the strategic value of the transmission point was worth. The Brotherhood knew that a free radio voice served their interests more effectively than a controlled one. The most powerful communications platform in the Capital Wasteland was kept free because the Brotherhood calculated that appearing not to control it was worth more than actually controlling it. The decision was filed as a tactical assessment. It was also a recognition that some forms of influence work better when they are not visible. Three Dogs' personal records at Genera describe the mechanics of that influence with unusual candor. The entries reference a series of informal meetings with elder lions, during which lions requested specific editorial decisions, certain Brotherhood operational information to be broadcast, certain casualty reports to be suppressed. Three Dogs' own notes document which requests he accepted and which he declined. One entry records told him I would mention the Citadel recruitment drive, told him I would not bury the patrol losses near the mall. He was not happy. He came back anyway. The Brotherhood's most significant media relationship was conducted through negotiated partial cooperation rather than control or genuine independence. The Wasteland's freest voice was partially edited by an arrangement both parties maintained because both parties found it useful. The file documenting this arrangement sits in the records of a broadcaster who described himself as the truth and was, partially, carefully, and with full awareness of the partial nature of it. The Brotherhood's monitoring of the broader Capital Wasteland radio environment was conducted through a dedicated scribe assignment tasked with logging all transmissions in the area, Genera programming, Enclave broadcasts, radar band communications, and any other signals that could be intercepted. Citadel terminal entries include excerpts from Enclave President Eden's broadcasts, alongside scribe annotations. Those annotations describe the broadcasts as propaganda with no operational intelligence, and note with increasing frequency that the delivery pattern shows repetition consistent with automated generation. The Brotherhood's radio monitoring team recognized that President Eden was not a human being before that recognition became widely available. They filed it under the appropriate category. They did not immediately act on what the filing implied, that the government the Enclave claimed to represent was being voiced by a machine that had been running without human oversight for an unspecified period. The recognition was recorded. Its consequences were deferred. The Citadel's own automated systems displayed a different kind of behavioral inconsistency during the same period. The security infrastructure, the turrets, force fields, and alert protocols designed to activate in response to hostile acts within the facility was built as a straightforward triggered response system. In practice, the alert escalation rate was found to vary based on the standing of the individual triggering it. Those with established Brotherhood membership could take actions that would immediately alert the system when performed by an unrecognized individual, but encountered a measurably slower escalation response. This variation was not documented as an intentional design feature. The alert system's response timing had been inadvertently connected to a reputation variable originally intended to affect dialogue and trade pricing, not security assessment. The most fortified structure in the Capital Wasteland had, through an unintentional connection in its own systems, built social standing into its threat response. The Citadel's defenses were slightly more forgiving to the Brotherhood's most trusted members. Trust in the Brotherhood's own security architecture reduced the speed of accountability. The guards at the Citadel's entry points followed a priority structure that reflected the same principle. Their behavioral pattern placed approaching hostile creatures at the highest monitoring priority, followed by unrecognized figures, then recognized individuals carrying unusual items, and recognized Brotherhood members at the lowest monitoring level. A senior Brotherhood member could enter the facility carrying recovered Enclave technology, unusual pre-war artifacts, or items that would logically trigger Brotherhood interest, without the entry point guards noting them. The supply terminal records show the same pattern. Items brought in by senior paladins were logged less consistently than items brought in by initiates. The Brotherhood's internal security was most rigorous toward those it trusted least, and most relaxed toward those it trusted most. The gap between policy and practice in the Citadel's security culture was shaped entirely by rank. One member of the Capital Wasteland Brotherhood, whose conduct became the subject of a formal internal record during this period, was Paladin Vargas, a field commander whose review file appears across 3 separate Citadel terminal entries. The specifics of the review established that Vargas had distributed Brotherhood medical supplies to a civilian settlement without elder authorization, in direct violation of Brotherhood resource protocols. The review board's conclusion is recorded as matter resolved. File closed. No punishment is noted. No corrective action is specified. The closing entry adds a single additional line. Paladin Vargas's field judgment and combat record remain exemplary. The Brotherhood examined a clear violation of its core doctrine, determined that the person responsible was too operationally valuable to discipline, and closed the file. The Brotherhood's rules and the Brotherhood's needs have always existed in negotiation with each other. The file that documents this particular negotiation ends with the negotiation resolved in favor of the Brotherhood's needs, and the rule quietly set aside. The DC ruins stretch out in the grey light, broken columns, empty reflecting pools. The long signal of Galaxy News Radio drifting over rubble that was once the centre of a country. And the Brotherhood patrols walk through it all, their armour intact, their records neat, their rules continuously being revised in quiet rooms by people who believe the rules are unchanged. From the streets of the capital wasteland, the path rises, past the broken monuments, past the citadel's walls, past the grey Virginia sky, upward into the space above the clouds where the Brotherhood's most ambitious construction moves slowly and steadily over the Commonwealth below. The Pridwen does not announce its arrival the way a ground force does. It announces its arrival the way a change in the light does, a shadow that crosses settlements before the shape casting it becomes visible, a sound that reaches the ground before the source can be identified. It is the Brotherhood made into weather. It is the Order's most complete expression of what it believes it is. The air at the Pridwen's altitude is clean, in a way that the wasteland below is not. Cold, thin, carrying nothing of the radiation and dust and human complexity that defines the ground. Up here, the Brotherhood is above all of that. Up here, the Brotherhood is above everything. The Pridwen is documented as the largest known airborne vehicle constructed in the post-war period, a military aircraft carrier assembled from salvaged pre-war components over approximately a decade of continuous construction effort. What the construction records reveal is that the project was not a Brotherhood-wide initiative endorsed by institutional consensus. It was Elder Arthur Maxson's personal undertaking, proposed when he was still a young officer, and pushed forward over the sustained objections of senior scribes who believed the resources being committed could be directed toward more immediately practical purposes. The ship that became the Brotherhood's most visible symbol of power existed, for years, only as one commander's insistence that it should exist, a future carried forward by one person's certainty against the institutional resistance of those who did not share it. The Pridwen's existence is, in this sense, a record of Maxson's will as much as it is a record of the Brotherhood's capability. The wind at this altitude moves across the Pridwen's hull with a low sound that is felt more than heard, a pressure against the outer structure that has been constant for every mile the ship has flown. The hull itself carries evidence of the compromises that construction required. The lower cargo platforms are not symmetrical. One side extends slightly further than the other, and the attachment points for secondary fuel containers are positioned differently on port and starboard. The original design documents called for a symmetrical lower hull. During construction, a shortage of uniform salvaged structural components required the engineering team to proceed with mismatched girders rather than delay the project further. The result is a ship that lists slightly under full cargo load, a condition recorded in an engineering terminal entry as within operational tolerance. The Pridwen is not perfectly built. It is built well enough to function, and it has continued to function. In the wasteland, the distance between those two standards is the distance most things capable of surviving have learned to accept. The lift system that keeps the ship airborne draws on knowledge that was not originally military in origin. Terminal entries in the engineering section record that the primary lift gas design was adapted from technical manuals recovered from a pre-war civilian airship maintenance depot in the Appalachian region, guides written for people who maintain tourist and commercial airships, not military ones. The scribe who located those manuals noted in a brief personal entry that the principles were sound and that pre-war engineers had known what they were doing. The Brotherhood's most advanced military vehicle carries, in its lifting system, the practical knowledge of civilians who built airships to carry passengers across mountain scenery. That knowledge was repurposed, as most things in the Brotherhood's archive eventually are, into something it was never originally intended for. Inside this vessel, the balance of its population reflects the mission it was built to serve. The crew manifest, accessible through command section terminal entries, shows a ratio of approximately 3 combat personnel, knights and paladins, to every 1 technical specialist. This is the inverse of the ratio that characterized Lost Hills during the Brotherhood's founding period, when scribes outnumbered warriors because the primary mission was preservation rather than projection. The shift is not incidental. The Commonwealth mission was designed as a military operation first and a technology recovery program second, and the Pridwen was crewed accordingly. The Brotherhood that built its identity around a library had, by the time the Pridwen was commissioned, built its flagship around an armory. The ratio changed because the mission changed. Whether the mission changed because the ratio changed, or the ratio changed because the mission changed, is a question the Brotherhood's records do not appear to have asked. The ship's defensive armament was not part of the original design. The laser turret array visible along the Pridwen's exterior was added during the final phase of construction, following an incident in which a prototype airship was damaged by ground fire during a reconnaissance mission over hostile territory. The incident report describes the damage as resulting from a calibration failure in threat assessment protocols, language that means, translated from Brotherhood administrative phrasing, that the design team had not fully accounted for the possibility that an obvious military vehicle flying at low altitude over hostile ground would be fired upon. The turrets were added after experience provided the instruction that planning had not. The ship was made safer by the lesson that it had not been safe enough. In the wasteland, most protective measures are designed after the thing they are designed to prevent has already happened once. Before the Pridwen arrived over the Commonwealth, an extended intelligence preparation phase had been conducted. Long-range scouts, radio intercept, analysis of recovered materials. Pre-mission summaries aboard the ship cover the Institute, the Railroad, the Minutemen, and major raider factions, with varying degrees of completeness. The Institute's summary is the most extensive and the most uncertain. Multiple entries note that Brotherhood intelligence on the Institute was severely limited by the target's non-surface presence. An organization operating entirely underground produced almost no observable signature for aerial or ground-based surveillance. The Brotherhood arrived over the Commonwealth with more preparatory intelligence than most previous operations had carried. And a gap in that intelligence that was exactly the shape of the most important thing it needed to understand. The Pridwen's files knew a great deal. They had a gap precisely where the greatest threat was located. Pale light from the Commonwealth's overcast sky moves across the Pridwen's observation deck, flat and even, the kind of light that reveals surfaces without warming them. That gap was addressed gradually through material analysis. Recovered synth components, hardware from synthetic humans that had been captured or destroyed by Brotherhood patrols, were brought to scribe analysis teams aboard the Pridwen for reverse engineering. Those teams mapped Institute manufacturing processes, power consumption patterns, and eventually signal frequencies through systematic examination of physical components. The resulting analysis terminal entries are the most technically dense documents in the Pridwen's readable record. They include dead ends, revised hypotheses, and entries that acknowledge the limits of current understanding with scientific precision. One entry notes that the manufacturing process is more sophisticated than current models predicted, and that baseline assumptions are being reassessed. The Brotherhood's scribes were doing genuine scientific work aboard a post-apocalyptic airship, in conditions those sciences were not designed for, producing results that actual scientists would recognize as real methodology. The archive of the Pridwen is, in parts, a record of original research conducted under extraordinary circumstances. The laboratory section of the ship holds evidence of another original research effort, an ongoing attempt to develop a more effective Radex synthesis than the pre-war formula the Brotherhood had been relying on. Lab terminal entries document more than a year of work without a stable result. One entry, written by the lead scribe on the project, notes that pre-war pharmaceutical knowledge is insufficient for the current radiation exposure profile, and that the wasteland's conditions exceed what the original formula was designed for. The Brotherhood carried the pre-war solution. The wasteland presented a problem the pre-war solution could not fully address. The archive was telling them something, and the something it was telling them was that the archive had limits. That is a difficult thing for an institution built on the completeness of its archive to record. The entry is written in the same tone as every other lab note. It does not raise its voice. Somewhere in the lower decks, among the weapons manuals and technical schematics and engineering assessments, a supply terminal log includes an entry for a pre-war civilian cookbook. It was recovered during a residential structure clearance in the early Commonwealth reconnaissance phase. It was flagged for disposal as non-strategic. The disposal was never completed. The log entry remains with no subsequent action recorded. Someone on the Pridwen carried a cookbook aboard, and no one removed it. The Brotherhood's flying archive of classified military knowledge contains, in an uncatalogued corner, someone's preservation of something that has nothing to do with survival in the institutional sense, a record of food, of the act of preparing it, of a domestic life that the wasteland ended, and that someone, without authorization or explanation, decided was worth keeping. Elder Maxon's personal terminal entries, accessible to those who have established significant standing with the Brotherhood's command structure, contain a voice that does not match the public one. His formal addresses are declarative, absolute, and without visible uncertainty. His personal entries are shorter. They reference dreams about the capital wasteland, the place where he grew up, where his Brotherhood identity was formed, where he knew people who are no longer present in the same way. One entry reads, "Dreamed about the Citadel again, the old training yard, mornings before the patrols went out." The person who commands the most powerful military force in the post-war East carries, in a private terminal, on a ship that does not touch the ground. The memory of a courtyard and a morning and a version of himself that existed before the institution required him to become what he became. His archive contains the record of that person. The institution does not officially acknowledge that the record exists. The Pridwen moves through the sky above the Commonwealth, its lights visible from every settlement below, its shadow crossing the rubble in silence, carrying its archive, its weights, its leaders' private memories, all of it flying, all of it still. From the Pridwen's altitude, the Commonwealth spreads in every direction, a grey-brown landscape of ruined streets and collapsed structures, interrupted by the occasional settlement light and the dark line of the harbour to the east. The descent from the airship to the ground is a descent from abstraction into weight. Up there, the Brotherhood sees everything. Down here, the Brotherhood occupies it. Boston Airport sits at the harbour's edge, flat, wide, and exposed in a way that most post-war settlements deliberately avoid. The runways extend in long straight lines that the wasteland has not yet reclaimed. The terminal buildings are large enough to hold several hundred people, which is precisely why the Brotherhood chose them. The salt air from the harbour moves through every open space at the airport in a steady, patient way, carrying rust and cold and the particular quality of a coastline that has been irradiated and is slowly recovering, very slowly, on its own terms. The Brotherhood has been here long enough to have made it theirs. It has not been here long enough to have forgotten what it was. Boston Airport's selection as the Brotherhood's primary ground base in the Commonwealth was made on the basis of 3 factors recorded in Elder Maxon's operational briefing: flat open ground for vertibird operations, structural integrity of the existing terminal buildings, and defensible perimeter potential using the airport's existing boundary walls. The briefing is precise and practical. It does not mention the location's symbolic quality, that a civilian airport designed to bring people together across distances, has been converted into a military installation designed to project power over a fixed region. The Brotherhood's use of Boston Airport inverts the building's purpose so completely that the original function becomes a kind of commentary, visible to anyone who looks at what the building was designed for and what it is now being used to do. The Brotherhood does not read it that way. The terminal is a barracks. The runways are a flight deck. The purpose is whatever the present requires, and the present requires a base. Pale light from the Commonwealth's overcast sky falls through the terminal's high windows in flat, even strips across the concrete floor below. The terminal's main hall retains one fixture from its original function that the Brotherhood documented and declined to remove. The departure board, the large flight information display that showed scheduled flights to destinations across pre-war America, was found intact when the Brotherhood secured the location. A facilities scribe terminal entry notes that the display's mounting infrastructure would require significant labor to remove, and that the space has adequate alternative applications as a briefing surface. The departure board was powered down and left in place. It remains in the background of Brotherhood operations at the airport, standing at the rear of what is now a military briefing area, still showing the last flights that were scheduled on the day the bombs fell. It is visible to anyone who looks up from the operational map spread across the table in front of it. Neither any Brotherhood record nor any official account draws attention to what it shows. It lists departures for cities that no longer exist, in a building that no longer serves its original purpose, readable to anyone in the room who happens to look in the right direction. No one is recorded as having done so. The people who were in the terminal when those flights were scheduled did not leave. Their remains are distributed throughout the building in a pattern that reflects what the airport's last hours looked like, concentrated near the departure gates, in the retail areas of the terminal's main level, and in the lower corridors near the service passages. Several sets of remains are positioned near windows that face the direction of Boston city center. The concentration and positioning are consistent with the population that was attempting to evacuate when the bombs fell, gathered in the places where evacuation would have required them to gather. In the final moments before the building became the place, they did not leave. Brotherhood personnel who used the terminal as a barracks moved through that population daily. No Brotherhood document references the remains. No record acknowledges their presence or their distribution. The dead of the airport's last day are part of the building's floor plan, unremarked upon, stepped around, present throughout every briefing and supply rotation and meal that takes place in the space they could not leave when it mattered. The Brotherhood's official position on pre-war human remains is recorded in a field protocol document accessible in the airport's operations terminal. Remains are classified as non-strategic environmental features, unless accompanied by items of technological significance, pit-boys, military-grade equipment, data storage devices carrying recoverable information. Remains without such accompanying items are to be left undisturbed as a matter of operational efficiency. The policy was designed to prevent time-consuming searches of sites unlikely to yield recoverable technology. In practice, it means the Brotherhood does not bury the dead it encounters. It classifies them, continues past them, and files the classification. The policy is not written with callousness as its intent. It produces callousness as its outcome, in the same administrative language and the same measured tone that every other Brotherhood field protocol is written in by the same institutional voice that has been writing in that tone since Lost Hills. Within the terminal's main entrance area, what the Brotherhood does actively preserve is arranged with deliberate care. The power armor stations near the terminal's main entrance hold active suits in various states of operational readiness, positioned facing outward toward the airport's exterior rather than inward toward the terminal floor. The outward-facing arrangement is functional. It allows for rapid deployment without requiring suits to be turned before use. But scribe notes in a terminal near the station describe the positioning as having been adjusted for visual effect during elder inspection tours. The Brotherhood's most recognizable military hardware is arranged to be seen by anyone approaching the facility from outside. The display was designed for an audience. When no inspection is scheduled, the suits remain facing the same direction. The Brotherhood performs the image of its own power as a continuous practice, not an occasional one. The armor faces outward, whether or not anyone is arriving to see it. The armor's condition is more complicated than its arrangement suggests. Power armor maintenance logs at Boston Airport include a recurring entry from the head armorer documenting an escalating problem. Salt air exposure from the harbor is accelerating corrosion in external plate components at a measurably higher rate than inland deployment conditions would produce. The reports are written over a period of months and chart a maintenance burden that has been growing steadily, while the chemical sealant supplies needed to address it have been running low. A supply officer's response terminal acknowledges the request for additional sealant. No subsequent entry confirms delivery. The Brotherhood's power armor, positioned on the coast of a post-nuclear harbor for maximum visual impact, is rusting at a rate the armorer can document with precision, and the supply chain has not been able to address. The order built to preserve all pre-war technology cannot fully preserve its own most visible equipment. The salt air is patient. The maintenance logs are not. The vertibird flight logs from Boston Airport include a crash report that sits in the records without resolution. A patrol flight that went down over the harbor area lists its cause as encounter with large flying creature, type unconfirmed. The pilot's report describes an animal with a wingspan exceeding the aircraft profile and an aggressive posture that resulted in a collision with the rotor assembly. The creature is not identified by name in the report. Based on the location and the physical description, examination of the available records suggests a creature type that does not correspond to any confirmed Commonwealth fauna, leading to a question the Brotherhood's own files leave open about whether the report reflects an actual unclassified creature, a misidentification under extreme conditions, or a reference to something that was documented in an earlier version of the Commonwealth's fauna records and subsequently removed. The Brotherhood filed a crash report about something it could not name. The creature does not appear in any subsequent patrol log. The report remains open. The salt-heavy air moves steadily through the terminal's upper ventilation, carrying the harbor's particular cold into every level of the building throughout the day and night. Brotherhood scribes at Boston Airport maintained a fauna observation log covering creature types encountered during Commonwealth operations: deathclaws, mirelurks, rad scorpions, feral ghouls, and several creature types specific to the Commonwealth environment. The log is organized by species, covering behavior patterns, tactical vulnerabilities, and estimated population density for each category. The entry for synths, synthetic humans produced by the Institute, the underground organization the Brotherhood had come to the Commonwealth specifically to address, is the most extensive entry in the log. The scribes categorized synths as artificial fauna, placing manufactured beings of potentially significant intelligence in the same taxonomic category as irradiated scorpions and mirelurk queens. The philosophical implications of that classification, whether a being capable of memory, relationship, and grief belongs in a fauna log, are not addressed anywhere in the entry. The scribes were conducting natural history documentation. They did not consider whether natural history was the right methodology for what they were documenting. The log does not ask that question. It simply continues. The synth detection protocol developed at Boston Airport under Proctor Quinlan's direction was designed to address the problem that artificial fauna posed. Specifically, the problem of distinguishing synthetic humans from biological ones in field and compound settings. Early versions of the protocol produced a false positive rate of approximately 1 in 5, flagging human test subjects as potentially synthetic based on behavioral markers. The protocol was revised multiple times. The final version in operational use reduced false positives to what the terminal entry describes as operationally acceptable levels, a threshold that is specified as a category rather than a number, and that is not defined further in any accessible record. The Brotherhood built a system to identify synths, discovered that the system also identified humans, and adjusted the threshold to a point the institution decided was acceptable without recording what that point was. The error rate of the Brotherhood's synth identification protocol is classified. The classification itself is the only available information about what the error rate is. Among the most restricted files in Boston Airport's terminal hierarchy is a security record documenting the identification and removal of a confirmed synth from the compound after an undisclosed period of residence. The file contains no name, no rank designation, no description of the individual's behavior or conduct during the time they were present. It records only that the subject was removed, that the situation was contained, and that personnel were briefed on enhanced screening procedures following the identification. The file was created after the revised detection protocol had been implemented, which means the synth in question had passed the improved screening and remained in place until a separate identification method was applied. How that identification was made, how long the individual had been present, and what information may have moved between Boston Airport and the Institute during that period are all absent from the record. The Brotherhood's most secure ground installation had been, for an unspecified duration, observed from inside its own perimeter. The file closes without answering the questions it raises. The airport continues to operate as though the answers do not matter, or as though filing the question is sufficient substitute for resolving it. The airport's lights stay on through the Commonwealth night. Vertibirds on the runways, paladins at their posts, the departure boards still listing flights that never left, and somewhere in the filing system, a classified entry sits closed, its details sealed, its implications running quietly beneath everything. Northwest from Boston Airport, following the road that Brotherhood patrols travel through the Commonwealth's ruined streets, the city's outer districts give way to Cambridge. A different kind of urban ruin, denser and louder and more contested than the airport's perimeter allows for. The buildings here press closer together. The streets are narrower. The lines of sight are shorter. Everything about Cambridge is less controlled than the airport, less managed, less Brotherhood in its current condition. And at the edge of it, in a building that was built for a different kind of order maintenance, a small Brotherhood unit holds a position that the larger organization's records describe as a forward operating base, and that the people inside it know as simply where they are, right now, trying to stay. Cambridge Police Station does not look like a Brotherhood facility from the outside. That is not an advantage. It simply reflects the reality of what a forward position is, a Brotherhood presence in a location where the Brotherhood's full infrastructure has not yet arrived. Cambridge Police Station in Fallout 4 is the Brotherhood's furthest forward ground position in the Commonwealth, held by a small unit under Paladin Dance's command, in sustained contact with hostile forces in the surrounding Cambridge area. Operation logs, accessible in the station's terminal document, the unit's situation in language that is different from any other Brotherhood record in the region. The entries are shorter, the sentences are less formal, the operational urgency is present in every line. One entry reads, "Resupply 40, 8 hours overdue, continuing as ordered." The Brotherhood at its forward edge does not write in the measured institutional language of Lost Hills, or the Citadel, or the Pridwen. It writes like people who are tired and are staying anyway, because staying is what the order requires, and the order is what they have. The dim light inside the station carries a different quality than the flat Commonwealth grey outside, more enclosed, more aware of the walls around it. Paladin Dance's personal terminal at the station contains entries that are more candid than his spoken communication suggests he is capable of being. In direct interaction, Dance is formal, certain, and mission-oriented. His private terminal entries record doubts about the station's long-term operational sustainability, concerns about the morale of the remaining unit members, and one entry that contains only a list of names. The members of his team who had been lost since the unit was stationed at Cambridge, with no accompanying text. 6 names. The entry immediately following that list is about maintenance schedules. Paladin Dance processes loss using the same method the Brotherhood has always used for processing difficult things. He files it, he notes it, and he continues with the next item. His private archive is the record of a person who has learned that keeping records and keeping moving are, in practice, the same skill. The protocol for acknowledging those losses is specified in operational documentation connected to Cambridge and expanded in Citadel records, a 30-second period of silence at the beginning of the first briefing following a casualty. No ceremony, no extended acknowledgement, no personal statements from surviving team members unless the commanding officer specifically authorizes them. 30 seconds of silence, and then the briefing continues. The protocol was designed with a specific institutional rationale. Grief compromises operational focus, and operational focus is what a forward position requires to remain functional. In Cambridge unit records, this protocol is referenced by a Brotherhood knight in passing, described with the matter-of-fact tone of someone describing a standard procedure. The listener receives it as information about a rule. The knight uses it as a practice that makes the next hour possible. Those are not the same relationship to the same 30 seconds. The station's ambient sound carries evidence of the position the unit is holding. Within the station's audio environment, a layer of feral ghoul vocalization runs at a volume calibrated just below the threshold of immediate conscious recognition, present enough to generate a low-level sense of unease in the space, low enough to avoid being registered as a distinct sound unless specific attention is directed toward it. The Brotherhood's operational logs reference ghoul activity in the surrounding Cambridge area as a persistent background condition that has not resolved since the unit was stationed here. The audio environment of the station reflects this. The sound team built the Brotherhood's exhaustion and their ongoing low-level threat exposure directly into the air of the building. The station sounds the way it feels to be inside it. That alignment between the auditory and the experiential is not accidental. It is the result of a specific design decision made to ensure that the space communicates its own condition without requiring anyone to explain it. Inside these rooms, two institutional identities occupy the same walls simultaneously. The station's interior retains the visual language of its pre-war function: wanted posters, booking desk infrastructure, evidence locker signage, in the areas the Brotherhood has not actively converted to its own use. In the spaces the Brotherhood does occupy, their equipment and markings have been layered over the pre-war police materials, rather than replacing them. The back rooms and upper floor remain largely undisturbed in their original configuration. The visual result is a space that reads differently in different areas. Part pre-war police station, part Brotherhood military outpost, neither fully erasing the other. The layering was intentional in the facility's design. Cambridge Police Station was meant to feel like one institution occupying another, each with its own definition of what maintaining order means, each present in the same building, neither having fully displaced the prior claim. The Brotherhood maintains order here in a building that was built to maintain order by someone who did not share the Brotherhood's definition of what order was for. One of the wanted posters that remains in the station's pre-war areas lists a charge of unauthorized access to restricted military technology files. The name on the poster is a placeholder from the documentation period, never replaced with a specific identity. The charge itself is of a specific type, precisely the category of offense that the Brotherhood of Steel was founded, in part to prevent. The pre-war government prosecuted individuals for accessing the military technology files that the Brotherhood was later built to protect, acquire, and hold. The charge predates the Brotherhood by decades. The building holds both the charge and the organization simultaneously, without acknowledging the relationship between them. The pre-war government and the post-war Brotherhood share, across the distance of 2 centuries and the width of a police station wall, the same fundamental position on who should be allowed to access military technology files, and what should happen to those who access them without authorization. The station's own security records include an incident report from before the current operational period, a record of a Brotherhood initiate who accessed the station's communication terminal without authorization and attempted to transmit on a frequency outside Brotherhood encryption protocols. The transmission was intercepted before it completed. The report records the initiate's action, notes that the communication terminal's access code was subsequently changed, and provides no further information. The initiate's identity is absent. Their fate is absent. What they were attempting to transmit, to whom, and whether the attempt reflected a compromised individual, a frightened soldier, or something more structurally significant. None of this is recorded in any accessible form. The Brotherhood filed the attempt. It classified the content. The unauthorized transmission is permanently absent from the record of its own incident report. The file documents that something was hidden. It does not document what was hidden. The communication security that the unauthorized transmission violated is itself documented in a classified operations guide accessible to those with sufficient standing. All field communications are conducted on rotating encrypted frequencies that change daily, with encryption keys generated aboard the Pridwen and distributed to field units through physical courier rather than electronic transfer. Several Cambridge operation logs reference couriers who were overdue. During courier delays, the Cambridge unit operated in effective communication silence with the broader Brotherhood structure, without daily keys, without the ability to transmit or receive on secured frequencies, without connection to the command infrastructure that gives the forward position its institutional context. The most secure communication system in the Commonwealth was also the one most vulnerable to a person being late. The Brotherhood's security and its isolation are not competing features. They are the same feature, expressed under different conditions. During one such communication blackout period, the station's assigned scribe undertook a project with no official mandate, a hand-drawn survey of the immediate Cambridge area, documenting street layouts, building structural conditions, and the territorial boundaries of creature populations in the surrounding blocks. The project was not authorized. The scribe, apparently, needed work. The resulting maps were later reviewed and retroactively approved by Paladin Dance, and were subsequently used as the basis for patrol route adjustments that reduced unit casualty rates in the following operational month. The scribe's unsanctioned work produced outcomes the Brotherhood valued. The retroactive approval record describes the project as demonstrating appropriate Brotherhood initiative. The Brotherhood's archive absorbed the unauthorized work, relabeled it under an approved category, and filed it as though the authorization had preceded the action. The record shows what was approved. It does not show what was asked for first, or what would have happened if the maps had not proved useful. Among the Cambridge station's longer-range planning documents is a development projection for the area that envisions the station as the anchor point for a Brotherhood-controlled district extending several city blocks, with proposed locations for scribe workshops, a recruitment processing center, and a weapons maintenance facility. The plan was written by a planning scribe aboard the Pridwen and transmitted to the Cambridge unit as a long-term objective document. None of its proposals are underway. The station is still holding its current position with the resources currently available, which are not the resources that a district expansion would require. The plan exists anyway. The Brotherhood's planning apparatus had already designed the expansion of a position that has not yet fully secured itself. The Brotherhood does not wait for the present to be stable before filing plans for what comes after it. It files the future before the present is secured, because the act of filing is itself a form of certainty, a way of insisting that the present will resolve in the direction the plan requires. Cambridge Police Station holds through another night. The ghoul sounds in the distance, the terminal entries accumulating, the future's plans folded in a drawer, and the morning briefing will begin with 30 seconds of silence, and then continue. From Cambridge, the path moves south through the Commonwealth's ruined streets, following the Charles River toward the harbour and the flat peninsula where Fort Strong sits at the water's edge. The character of the landscape changes as the harbour approaches. The ruins become lower, more spread out, and the salt air from the water begins to carry more weight. Fort Strong is visible before its details are clear, a pre-war military installation that was built to last, and has, in the specific way that things built for containment tend to outlast everything around them. The walls are thick, the perimeter is defined. The harbor light reflects off the water behind it in a way that makes the facility look, at certain angles, like something rising from the sea. It was built to hold something that was never meant to be used. The Brotherhood arrived 200 years later and unlocked it. Fort Strong was a pre-war United States Army installation that served as a nuclear ordnance depot, specifically a storage and maintenance facility for tactical nuclear devices, including the mini-nuke, a man-portable nuclear warhead designed for use with the Fat Man launcher. The Brotherhood secured it as a strategic objective early in their Commonwealth operations, and the facility's original function made it immediately useful without requiring conversion. Terminal entries in the command section record that when Brotherhood forces entered Fort Strong, the storage vaults were still sealed. The nuclear ordnance inside had been secured by automated lockdown protocols that activated when contact with the chain of command was lost, and had remained sealed without interruption for over 200 years. The Brotherhood did not capture Fort Strong's arsenal. They found an arsenal that had been waiting in precisely the condition it was left in for someone who arrived with the correct codes. The waiting had been patient and undisturbed. The Brotherhood provided the codes. The thick walls of Fort Strong's lower levels carry a silence that is different from the silence of abandoned places. Heavier, more deliberate. The silence of a space designed to contain something. Those codes were recovered from a pre-war military communications terminal located in a support building adjacent to the main facility. The terminal had been operating on battery backup for over 2 centuries. Its power source degraded to the point where the display was barely legible when Brotherhood scribes accessed it. Terminal entries from the Fort Strong establishment period describe the recovery process. A scribe working in poor light, manually transcribing code sequences from a flickering screen, asking a colleague to confirm each character before moving to the next. The codes that unlocked 200 years of sealed nuclear ordnance were obtained through a data entry process conducted by hand, in near darkness, by a person whose name does not appear in the recovery report. The most consequential transcription task in the Commonwealth's post-war history was an act of careful, patient, anonymous clerical work performed under difficult conditions by someone the Brotherhood's archive did not consider worth naming. The inventory system those codes gave access to follows a structure the Brotherhood did not design. The management protocol for Fort Strong's nuclear devices, categorizing mini-nukes by yield classification, storage condition, and operational readiness, matches the pre-war Army's nuclear ordnance management format for tactical field weapons, recovered from the same terminal that provided the access codes and adopted intact rather than replaced. Fort Strong's nuclear weapons are currently managed using paperwork practices developed before the war by an organization that did not exist before the war, tracking devices that contributed to the destruction of the civilization responsible for all 3 of those things. The continuity of the paperwork across 200 years and a nuclear exchange is not something the Brotherhood's records acknowledge as notable. The format was sound. It was preserved. That is what the Brotherhood does with things that function. One entry in that inventory does not match the format around it. Among Fort Strong's mini-nuke inventory entries, each formatted identically, each assigned a yield rating and a storage date, there is one entry for a device whose yield classification is listed approximately 30% above standard mini-nuke specifications. The entry carries no explanation. A follow-up note from the Brotherhood's chief armorer, records only, origin unclear, stored separately, treat as hazardous. The device is held in an isolated sublevel, away from the main inventory. No subsequent Fort Strong terminal entry references it. The Brotherhood's most carefully managed armory contains one weapon that exceeds the parameters of every other weapon around it, described in 4 words that raise every question they do not answer. What it is, where it came from, and whether its origins are known to anyone who has not been given access to the sub-level, filed under unknown, with no review date specified. Items of uncertain origin are addressed in a field acquisition protocol document, accessible at Fort Strong, designated as assessment hold items, available for emergency use but not integrated into standard operational supply, and subject to ongoing scribe division analysis. In practice, the assessment hold category at Fort Strong has expanded steadily over the period of Brotherhood occupation. Terminal entries from later in the Commonwealth mission period note that the assessment hold inventory has grown to occupy significant storage space within the facility. The Brotherhood collects faster than it analyzes. Its archive contains, in a section that has been growing without a corresponding increase in the analysis rate, a catalogue of everything it possesses and does not yet understand. The section grows. The analysis rate does not keep pace. The Brotherhood's most honest record is the one that documents the distance between what it holds and what it knows about what it holds. Beyond the ordnance and the inventory systems, Fort Strong holds something the Brotherhood does not use and has not converted to institutional purposes. The facility's residential areas, barracks, mess hall, recreation room, remain in the condition they were in when the pre-war army left them. The Brotherhood houses its personnel at Boston Airport and does not occupy Fort Strong's living spaces. These areas have been cleared for salvage assessment and left. In them, the objects that pre-war soldiers left behind remain where they were placed. A paperback novel with a bookmark at Chapter 7, a handwritten letter that was never sent, a pair of boots positioned neatly under a bunk. These objects exist inside a weapons depot, a facility whose entire institutional purpose is the storage of devices designed for mass destruction. The domestic details of the people who lived here while guarding that purpose make the purpose itself harder to hold as a single thought. The person who left a bookmark at Chapter 7 was stationed at a nuclear weapons depot. Both of those things were true at the same time. The objects hold that simultaneity without resolving it. One terminal in the barracks area contains a draft letter that was never completed. Written in the casual language of personal correspondence addressed to a sibling, the letter discusses the writer's dissatisfaction with their assignment and their intention to request a transfer after the current rotation ends. It stops mid-sentence, either interrupted or abandoned. What makes this letter specifically notable within Fort Strong is its last complete sentence, a question asked in the casual register of someone writing to a family member who would understand. Do you know what we are guarding here? Nobody tells us what it is actually for. A soldier stationed at a nuclear weapons depot, asking in a private letter what the weapons were for, in the same year the weapons were used. 200 years later, the Brotherhood arrived, unlocked the storage vaults, and began managing the inventory. The question in the letter was never answered by anyone who had the authority to answer it. The letter is still in the terminal. The question is still in the letter. The Brotherhood's own information structure at Fort Strong replicates the compartmentalization the letter was written inside. Different personnel have access to different levels of inventory data. The scribe managing standard mini-nuke inventory does not have access to the anomalous yield device's sublevel, and the night handling facility security does not have access to the inventory terminal. The system is designed to prevent a single captured or compromised individual from providing complete intelligence on the arsenal. It also means no single person at Fort Strong holds a complete picture of what the facility contains. The Brotherhood guards its most sensitive armory by ensuring that the people inside it do not fully know what they are guarding. The structure from Mariposa, workers present at a facility whose full purpose was classified above their level, has been preserved in the Brotherhood's own operational design 200 years later in a facility the Brotherhood controls entirely. The pattern persists because the rationale persists. Compartmentalization is not a historical artifact. It is a current policy. Fort Strong's role in broader Brotherhood operational planning is documented in a Pridwen terminal entry designating it as the fallback armory in the event that the Boston Airport compound becomes untenable. The fallback plan notes the estimated time required to relocate essential personnel from the airport and outlines the procedures for transitioning primary supply operations. What the plan does not address is the scenario in which Fort Strong itself becomes untenable. The contingency planning extends to the last position before the final one, and stops. There are no filed instructions for what the Brotherhood does with a nuclear arsenal if the last secure position for that arsenal is no longer secure. The planning horizon ends at the point where the question becomes too large for planning to address, and the archive simply does not contain the next page. Among the items recovered during the initial securing of Fort Strong is a pre-war United States Army flag, folded in the military triangular presentation style, found in a glass case in the base commander's office. The Brotherhood's recovery log classifies it as a pre-war artifact, ceremonial, non-strategic. It was not disposed of. It was not transferred to the Citadel or to any other Brotherhood archive. The log entry shows it remaining at Fort Strong in storage, in the facility where it was found, in a building that holds weapons capable of ending thousands of lives. The Brotherhood classified the flag as the item least worth relocating, a folded piece of cloth from a country that no longer exists, kept in a weapons depot in the city that country once considered its most important military harbor. The Brotherhood preserves technology with systematic care, symbols it does not always know what to do with. The flag remains in storage. The inventory continues around it. Fort Strong's walls hold the weight of what is stored here. The careful inventories, the anomalous sublevel, the unsent letter, the folded flag, and outside, the salt air continues its slow work on the armor, patient and uncatalogued. From the Commonwealth's harbour and the weight of Fort Strong's walls, the path moves away from the coast entirely, north and west, through territory that grows quieter and greener and colder as the elevation rises. The Appalachian Mountains do not look like the wasteland. They look like what the wasteland forgot to destroy. Dense forest, river valleys, ridgelines that catch cloud and hold it. The ruin here is different from the ruin in Boston or Washington. It is less visible. The trees have had 200 years to grow back over the broken things, and in many places they have succeeded. Fort Defiance sits high in those mountains, in a building that was designed for isolation long before the Brotherhood arrived. The Allegheny Asylum was a pre-war psychiatric facility, a place built specifically to remove people from the world and hold them in a controlled environment for their own treatment or the world's protection, depending on the period and the case. Its stone construction was built to last. Its remote mountain location was chosen for the same reasons mountain locations are always chosen for facilities that need to be separated from population centers. When the Brotherhood chapter arrived in Appalachia to investigate reports of unusual energy readings and biological anomalies, they assessed the asylum and found it suitable. Solid walls, defensible elevation, enough interior space for the chapter's operational needs. Terminal entries at Fort Defiance record the selection rationale in practical terms. What those entries do not address is the quality of the irony. The building was designed to isolate people from the world. The Brotherhood found that an appropriate architecture for an organization that had been making the same choice about itself since Lost Hills. Mountain mist moves through the tree line below the asylum's upper windows, slow and grey, the way weather moves at elevations where it has nowhere particular to go. When the Brotherhood entered the Allegheny Asylum and began establishing Fort Defiance, the building's interior contained thousands of pre-war patient records, case files and physical binders stored in the records room, representing the medical histories and personal documentation of everyone who had been committed to the facility before the war. Brotherhood establishment logs note that the records room was cleared and the binders placed in storage to make way for supply crates. The patient files are present in the environment of Fort Defiance as objects that exist but cannot be read. Physical documentation of lives that the Brotherhood's arrival categorized as background. The people those files belonged to were not soldiers. They were not enemies. They were people who had been sick and had been treated in this building, and their records were moved aside for ammunition and equipment without any document noting that the move had a human dimension. The Brotherhood's arrival reorganized the space. The people who had occupied it before became furniture. The Brotherhood's medical operations at Fort Defiance were, by necessity, more extensive than standard Brotherhood deployment medicine. The Appalachian region presented biological threats with no equivalent in any prior Brotherhood operational area. The scorched plague, a disease transmitted by the scorch beasts that dominated the region's higher elevations, and a range of radiation-related conditions that exceeded the profiles the Brotherhood's medical protocols had been written to address. Medical scribe terminals at Fort Defiance document treatments, case histories, and ongoing research into the scorched plague's transmission mechanism across a period of months. One research entry records an observation that had no precedent in Brotherhood medical records. The plague appeared to affect power armor wearers at a measurably lower rate than unarmored individuals, suggesting that the armor's filtration systems were providing a degree of biological protection beyond their design specifications. The Appalachian Brotherhood was conducting, without having planned to, a clinical study on power armor's capacity as a barrier against biological contamination. Their armor was performing in ways its documentation had not promised. The documentation was, for once, behind what the thing could actually do. Inside these stone walls, the records accumulated: medical observations, encounter reports, supply requests, each one a small piece of a picture that was growing darker as the months passed. The encounter reports for Scorch Beast engagements tell a consistent story across multiple entries. Standard Brotherhood anti-personnel tactics performed adequately against Scorch Beasts engaged on the ground. Against Scorch Beasts in aerial flight, the same tactics produced losses that the reports describe with increasing directness as the engagement record accumulated. One operations officer's analysis entry states the conclusion without qualification: "We were not designed to fight what lives in the sky." The Brotherhood of Steel, which had built the Pridwen and chosen the sky as its most powerful operational position, found itself outmatched in aerial combat by a creature that had made the same structural choice. The organization that understood flight as a form of power encountered a threat that understood flight as a form of predation, and the difference between those two relationships to the sky was measured in Brotherhood casualties across multiple engagement reports. The engineering scribes at Fort Defiance attempted to address the aerial combat problem through development. A modified shoulder mount launcher system capable of engaging high-altitude targets was designed, documented across several months of development notes, and eventually produced in a working prototype. The prototype was used in 3 recorded engagements with positive results. The scribe who designed it, identified in the terminal entries only by their initials, was listed as killed in action in a Scorchbeast encounter shortly after the 3rd documented use. The development notes end at that entry. A subsequent entry, written by a different scribe, records that the prototype launcher is in storage and that reassignment of project resources is pending. The pending designation was never updated. The project was never resumed. The Brotherhood's most promising technical response to the threat that was ending the chapter was filed as pending when the person who understood it best was no longer available to continue it. The idea outlasted its inventor by exactly 1 administrative notation. The mountain wind moves through the upper levels of Fort Defiance in a way that the stone walls cannot fully stop. A cold, steady presence that has been moving through these corridors since before anyone built walls to move through. The end of the Appalachian Brotherhood chapter is documented across Fort Defiance's terminal entries, not as a single event, but as a process, an accumulation of losses that exceeded the chapter's capacity to replace them. Supply lines that grew unreliable and then stopped. A plague the chapter could study and document and not cure. The terminal entries from the chapter's final operational period are shorter than the early ones. The sentences are simpler. The formal institutional language that characterized the founding entries has contracted. Later entries record supply requests that were never fulfilled, casualty tallies without accompanying analysis, and one entry that contains only a date and 2 words: "We held." The last dated entry is followed by silence. There is no closing statement, no final report, no document that formally ends the chapter's operational record. The record simply stops, because the people who were writing it were no longer in a position to continue. An institution that defined itself through its archive ended when there was no one left to add to the archive. What those last Brotherhood members left behind was written for someone who had not yet arrived. Several terminal entries at Fort Defiance were written in the present tense, addressed to a future reader, assuming that reinforcements were coming, that someone would arrive and need to be briefed on current conditions and operational status. The entries explain what the threat is, where the supplies are, what the situation has been, and what it currently is. They were written by people who believed their chapter would be continued by someone. When those entries were eventually found, the people who found them became, in a specific way, the audience those writers had been writing for. The dead Brotherhood of Appalachia addressed a reader. The reader arrived, decades later, and read what had been left. The archive functioned as intended. The function was delayed by 200 years. The Brotherhood wrote for a future that eventually arrived, just not the future anyone writing those entries had been imagining. Among the items stored at Fort Defiance during the chapter's operational period is a seed vault, a collection of pre-war plant genetic material recovered from a university research facility early in the Appalachian mission. Supply terminal entries reference it as a biological archive of pre-war provenance, with undetermined strategic value. The seed vault has no operational function in the available records of Fort Defiance. It exists as a labeled container in the environment, present and identified and not connected to any active program. Its presence in the Brotherhood's archive reflects something about the chapter's character that the encounter reports and casualty tallies do not capture directly. They were not only fighting, they were collecting. In a fortress that was under biological siege, with losses mounting and supply lines failing, the Brotherhood instinct to preserve had continued operating. The seed vault was filled before the chapter's situation became critical. The preservation instinct outlasted the capability to defend what was being preserved. The Brotherhood kept filling the archive until it could no longer hold the archive. Fort Defiance is the Brotherhood's most complete institutional failure, not in the military sense of a defeated force, but in the deeper sense of an endpoint that was not recovered from, not documented by the broader Brotherhood, and not preserved in any subsequent chapter's official record. Other Brotherhood positions that fell were rebuilt or accounted for. Fort Defiance simply ended, and the broader Brotherhood did not send anyone to retrieve the archive, recover the seed vault, or record what the Appalachian chapter had learned about the Scorch Plague at the cost of its own survival. The Brotherhood of Steel was built on the principle that nothing worth preserving should be lost. The Appalachian chapter's records sat in a powered building in the Appalachian Mountains, unread, for decades after the chapter ended. The order that had dedicated itself to ensuring the pre-war world was not forgotten, forgot its own forward position. The archive that the Brotherhood promised to keep, the Brotherhood could not keep. Fort Defiance stands in the Appalachian dark, its power still running, its terminals still lit, its last entries waiting, and the mountains hold the silence of an institution that was not retrieved. Deeper into Appalachia, away from Fort Defiance and the weight of its ending, the path moves through forest and along river valleys toward higher ground. The Appalachian landscape grows more spare at elevation, the trees shorter, the rock more visible, the sky wider and colder and more present. At Seneca Rocks, a formation of quartzite ridges rises sharply from the valley floor below in a way that draws the eye upward, whether or not there is anything at the top worth seeing. The Brotherhood decided there was. They built a small outpost there, on high ground with long sight lines in every direction, and stationed someone in it to watch. The outpost is small. The view from it is very large. That was the point. Seneca Rock's outpost in Fallout 76 was established as a long-range observation post, a position selected specifically for the elevation it provided and the corresponding line of sight coverage across a significant portion of Appalachian terrain. The Brotherhood's intelligence doctrine for new operational areas required visual dominance of a region before committing ground forces, understanding what was happening in a landscape from a position above it before sending people into it. Terminal entries at the outpost document the establishment rationale, the specific coverage area the elevation provided, and the rotation schedule for personnel assigned to observation duty. The documentation is detailed and precise for what is, in physical terms, a small structure on a high rock. The Brotherhood applied the same rigorous filing standards to a two-person observation post that it applied to the Citadel and the Pridwen. The archive does not scale with the physical size of the location being documented. Everything gets a file. The file for Seneca Rocks is indistinguishable in format from the file for any other Brotherhood position, regardless of how many people are in it. Cold air moves across the outpost's exposed upper level at all hours, carrying nothing from below except distance. The observation logs that accumulated at Seneca Rocks document the spread of scorched activity across the Appalachian landscape in real time, entry by entry, across months of watching, a record of a disaster expanding from isolated incidents into something with a different character. Early entries note scorched individuals in separate groups with no apparent coordination. Middle period entries describe those groups consolidating into larger concentrations moving in similar directions. Later entries document scorched movement in patterns the observing scribe describes in one entry as organized, a word that appears once in the log, underlined in the terminal's formatting, and does not appear again. The note immediately following that entry reads, confirming observation, maybe observer error. The Brotherhood's most complete real-time record of the Scorched Plague's progression was written by a person who was not entirely certain they could trust their own observation. The logs contain the truth and the doubt about the truth in the same entry, because the scribe was doing the thing that honest documentation requires, recording what was seen and flagging what could not yet be confirmed. That observation, combined with engagement data from Fort Defiance, produced a classified assessment that was transmitted to Fort Defiance Command and not distributed to general personnel. The assessment concluded that scorched activity was being influenced by Scorchbeast proximity in ways that suggested directional control rather than random dispersal, that the plague's carriers and its primary vectors were operating in a coordinated relationship rather than independently. The Brotherhood had documented evidence that the threat it was facing was organized at a level that had strategic implications beyond biological containment. The assessment was filed, classified as requiring further investigation, and noted as pending review. The further investigation was never conducted before the chapter's operational capacity ended. The Brotherhood's most significant analytical conclusion about the Appalachian threat sits in a file marked pending in a fortress that was subsequently abandoned. The discovery was made. It was recorded. It was not acted upon. The file remains open. The records from Seneca Rocks and Fort Defiance were expanded in later periods through additional documentation added to the existing archive, entries that referenced earlier observation logs and created connections between records that had originally existed without those connections. Several of these later additions contain minor date inconsistencies with the original documentation, small numerical discrepancies in the Brotherhood's internal timeline that became visible when the records were examined together. The Brotherhood's archive at Seneca Rocks, in other words, is not entirely consistent with itself across the full span of its documentation. The organization, built around meticulous record-keeping, has records that contain small contradictions based on when different portions of the archive were written. The archive is comprehensive. It is not seamless. The Brotherhood's files, examined closely enough, contain the evidence of the different hands that contributed to them at different times, each working from a slightly different version of the record that preceded them. Within this outpost's small interior, two separate accounts of the same period exist side by side. The scribe assigned to Seneca Rocks during the primary observation period left behind two parallel records, the official observation log and a personal log maintained separately. The official log is precise, consistently dated, and written in the impersonal register of formal reporting. The personal log is different in almost every way. It records the weather in the morning before the official observation begins. Fog again, full coverage, no observation possible, the quality of the rations, and a recurring notation about a specific rock formation visible from the outpost's primary window that the scribe describes as unreasonably beautiful. The person who maintained the most disciplined official record in the Appalachian Brotherhood's observation network also maintained a private record of fog and light and a rock formation that had no strategic value. The Brotherhood asked for one of those records. The other existed anyway. Both were written by the same person, in the same place, at the same time, because the same person contains more than one kind of attention simultaneously. The personal log ends before the official log does. The last personal entry reads, resupply 2 weeks late, radio silence from Defiance, writing this by lantern, the fog is down. There are no personal entries after that. The official log continues for 11 more days. The same handwriting, the same format, the same dated observations and weather notations, after the personal entries have stopped. The scribe continued writing the official record after they had stopped writing privately. They documented the landscape and its conditions until they could not anymore. In the professional register that the Brotherhood had asked for 11 days after they had nothing left to say in their own voice. The gap between the last personal entry and the last official one is 11 days long. What occupied those 11 days is in the gap, in the space between the last private word and the last professional one, in the silence where grief would have been if the format had allowed for grief. No Brotherhood protocol addresses the experience of long-term, isolated assignment. The Field Medical Guide at Fort Defiance covers radiation exposure, combat wound treatment, and scorch plague symptom management in detail. It does not include a section on isolation. It does not address the experience of being the only Brotherhood member in a location for weeks or months, of having no human contact except the radio frequencies that fall silent. The Brotherhood's archive of pre-war and post-war medical knowledge, which is among the most comprehensive collections of its kind in the wasteland, contains no formal acknowledgement that the people sent to isolated observation posts were experiencing something that required support beyond supply rotations and communication check-ins. The scribe at Seneca Rocks was fully equipped by every Brotherhood standard that applied to their assignment. The equipment list was complete. The missing item was not on any list, because no one had written it down. Across the entire record of the Brotherhood of Steel, from Lost Hills to Mariposa to the Hub, from the Citadel to the Pridwen, from Bunker Alpha to Fort Defiance to this small outpost on a high rock, the same pattern appears in document after document. The institution is comprehensively recorded. The individuals inside it are recorded incompletely. Equipment has condition reports. People have conduct reports. The arsenal at Fort Strong has a catalogue entry for every device, including the anomalous one. The scribe at Seneca Rocks has an assignment manifest. The Brotherhood has preserved more information about the objects its members carry than about the members who carry them. The archive of one of the most powerful organizations in the post-war world is, at its structural center, a record of things. The people are present in it as holders of things, as operators of positions, as names on assignment manifests and casualty tallies. The things are described. The people are listed. In the Brotherhood's archive, the foreground is equipment and the background is the person who maintains it. In the outpost sleeping area, on a shelf among the Brotherhood supply containers, there is a small object that carries no item designation and cannot be moved or examined through any available means. It is visible, a rendered object consistent with pre-war civilian manufacture, placed on the shelf as environmental detail by someone who wanted the space to feel inhabited by a specific person, rather than by a generic Brotherhood position. It has no name in any accessible record. It has no lore connection, no quest function, no entry in any Brotherhood inventory. In the context of Seneca Rocks, an outpost held by a single scribe who wrote about fog and called a rock formation unreasonably beautiful, and stopped writing privately 11 days before they stopped writing officially, the object on the shelf reads as belonging to someone. The Brotherhood's archive never named it. It has no file. It sits on the shelf in an outpost on a high rock in the Appalachian Mountains, unnamed, uncatalogued, and that is the entirety of the available information about it. Seneca Rocks stands above the fog, the observation logs filed, the personal entries finished, the unnamed object on the shelf, and the mountain holds what was left there, patient and silent, waiting for no one in particular. From the Appalachian Mountains, the path crosses the continent one final time, west and south, through the long interior, past the ruins of cities that the wasteland has processed differently in different regions, until the landscape opens into the particular quality of Southern California, wide, flat, sun-bleached. The ruin here spread across former suburbs and freeways, rather than concentrated in towers and dense urban blocks. The Los Angeles wasteland does not feel closed in the way the East Coast ruins feel. It feels emptied. The sky above it is very large and very bright, and the things that used to fill the space below that sky have been reduced to their outlines. The Brotherhood arrived here from the East, carrying everything the Brotherhood carries, and the wasteland received them the way it receives everything, without comment, in the heat, under the sun. The Brotherhood of Steel, as depicted in the Fallout television series, represents something that the games had not previously attempted in extended form, a portrayal of Brotherhood life from the perspective of a low-ranking member who has not yet internalized the institution's values, and is experiencing them from inside for the first time. In every game, the relationship to the Brotherhood is established quickly. A character is a member, or becomes one, or operates against the organization from outside. The perspective is either institutional or adversarial. Maximus, in Season 1 of the Fallout television series, offers a third position, someone who wanted the Brotherhood before he understood it, who joined as a child after witnessing the organization's power, and who follows the institution through his growing recognition that what he joined is not what he believed he was joining. The production team described this arc as specifically designed to examine what it costs to belong to the Brotherhood, a question the games tend to present as having already been answered by the time the player arrives. Faded billboard frames rise above the cracked Los Angeles freeway below, their surfaces long emptied of whatever messages they once carried, standing because the structures were built to outlast their content. The cost of belonging begins with formation. The Squire program depicted in Season 1 of the television series shows a process built on physical conditioning, discipline enforcement, and the systematic transmission of the Brotherhood's own account of its history and purpose. Young initiates receive instruction that frames the Brotherhood's technology hoarding as stewardship rather than accumulation, their military actions as protection rather than occupation, and their isolation from the outside world as wisdom rather than fear. The writers describe the Squire curriculum as modeled on real-world institutional formation practices. The process is used by military academies, religious orders, and elite schools that share the feature of constructing a complete understanding of the world in young people before those people have developed the independent experience required to evaluate that understanding. The Brotherhood forms its members young and forms them completely. The television series presents this not as sinister policy, but as something sadder, an institution that genuinely believes it is preparing its children for a difficult world, using methods that make independent judgment harder to develop than the institution acknowledges. The physical reality of Brotherhood membership was rendered in the television series in a way that extended beyond the visual. The power armor depicted in Season 1 was built using the T-60 armor from Fallout 4 as a design reference, modified for actor wearability and screen readability. The practical pieces constructed for scenes requiring physical interaction weigh considerably more than standard film costumes. Actors in behind-the-scenes documentation describe extended movement in Brotherhood armor as genuinely exhausting, a physical experience that the production did not attempt to minimize. because the exhaustion became part of what the armor communicated about the people wearing it. The armor that functions as the Brotherhood's most recognizable symbol of power also physically burdens the person inside it, in ways that the symbol does not acknowledge. That relationship between what the armor represents and what it costs to wear became part of the series' characterization of the Brotherhood without having been planned as a thematic device. It was discovered when the actors put the armor on and tried to move. Maximus's specific relationship to power armor across Season 1 follows an arc the production team described as deliberately constructed, beginning with the armor as an object of desire and culminating in the recognition that the armor does not provide the identity he was seeking when he wanted it. He acquires the armor through deception rather than earned rank. The series frames him inside it visually in ways that change as his understanding changes. Early scenes placing the armor in heroic compositions that emphasize its scale and presence. Later scenes positioning the camera to show Maximus as small within the armor, uncertain, the suit's physical dominance working against, rather than for the person inside it. The cinematographic treatment was coordinated between the production designer and the showrunners, and written into the shot plans before filming. The Brotherhood's most iconic symbol was used across the season to demonstrate that symbols do not resolve the questions they appear to answer. The armor does not make Maximus into what he wanted to be. It makes him visible as someone who wanted that, and did not become it. The sun over the Los Angeles wasteland does not change its quality regardless of what happens beneath it. The same flat, bright, patient light that has been falling on these ruins since the bombs cleared the initial cloud cover 200 years ago. Season 2 of the Fallout television series, released between December 2025 and February 2026, extends the Brotherhood's presence into the Mojave Wasteland, the setting of Fallout New Vegas, and in doing so brings the television version of the Brotherhood into direct contact with the game lore of that region. The Brotherhood chapter depicted in Fallout New Vegas is isolated, reduced in capability, and largely withdrawn from active operations in the Mojave. The Brotherhood shown in Season 2 of the television series operates with a level of active field presence that does not align with that characterization. The discrepancy has generated sustained discussion about canonical consistency, whether the television series is depicting the Brotherhood at a different point in the Mojave timeline, or whether the series has made choices that depart from the game's established lore for narrative reasons. The production team has not released detailed public statements addressing the question. Two versions of the Brotherhood occupy the same desert, in records that do not agree about what the Brotherhood in that desert looks like. The files, for now, remain in contradiction. The television series also introduced Brotherhood roles that have no equivalent in any Fallout game. A chaplain position, a member of the Order providing spiritual or pastoral counsel to Brotherhood personnel, appears in Season 1 without precedent in game canon. The Brotherhood in the games is organized around institutional loyalty and technical hierarchy rather than spiritual practice, and no game has depicted anything resembling a pastoral role within its structure. The chaplain's presence in the television series raised questions about whether the role represents a development in the Brotherhood's post-game timeline, a creative expansion of the institutional portrait, or a choice made to reflect how real military organizations function that the games had simply not depicted. No game has addressed the chaplain's existence. The role remains a television series-specific element of Brotherhood institutional life, one that fits the organization's ceremonial character well enough that its absence from the game depictions reads, in retrospect, more as an omission than a contradiction. The social texture of Brotherhood life that the television series rendered most completely was the informal hierarchy, the ways ranking systems function not only in command situations, but in the spaces between them. Season 1 depicted mess hall culture, communal meals, ambient conversation among Brotherhood members in relaxed settings, and the specific way that lower-ranking members modulate their behavior and speech around higher-ranking ones, even when no mission is active and no formal authority is being exercised. Those scenes showed what the games had not shown, because games do not typically place the player in the role of an observer at a meal, that the Brotherhood's hierarchy is not a feature of command situations. It is continuous. It is present in where people sit and how they speak and what they discuss when the institution is not formally requiring anything of them. The ranking system does not pause at meals. The institution does not have an off state. Season 2's expanded storyline, through Norm MacLean's continuing investigation of Vault 31 and the broader Vault-Tec conspiracy, placed the Brotherhood's post-war emergence inside a larger pre-war framework of institutional planning. The arc established that the conditions under which post-war military organizations developed were not entirely accidental, that pre-war planning had anticipated certain outcomes and had structured circumstances in ways that shaped what came after. This does not position the Brotherhood as a Vault-Tec creation or a deliberately engineered faction. It places the Brotherhood inside a longer history of institutional design that predates its founding. The files the Brotherhood has been building since Lost Hills exist inside a filing system that was started before the Brotherhood existed to contribute to it. The organization that built itself on preserving the past is itself a consequence of planning done before its own beginning. Taken across both seasons, the television series presents the Brotherhood as an institution that is simultaneously the post-war world's most capable organization and the one most committed to producing the conditions of its own isolation. It preserves technology and uses that preservation to ensure that no one outside the order can access what has been preserved. It trains its members with genuine care and forms them in ways that make independent moral judgment more difficult than the formation acknowledges. It is powerful, and it is separated from what it claims to protect by the same qualities that generate the power. The television series does not condemn the Brotherhood for this. It does not celebrate it. It renders the organization with the same careful ambivalence the games have maintained across decades. An institution that was built from a genuine moral crisis, that operates from values it believes in, and that produces outcomes the values alone do not fully explain. The Brotherhood's files, across all games and both seasons of the television series, tell the story of an organization that knows what it is doing. It has not yet decided whether knowing is the same as understanding. The Los Angeles wasteland stretches in every direction beneath the sun, cracked streets, the outlines of burned palms, Brotherhood vertibirds moving above it all in their slow patrol patterns. And somewhere in the ruins, someone in armor is deciding whether the armor makes them what they hoped it would. There is no new location to arrive at. The journey does not end by walking through another door or descending another staircase or crossing another threshold into another specific place. The path is run through 14 locations, from the sealed bunker in California where a captain read a history book, to the mountain asylum where a chapter wrote for a reader who arrived too late, to the sun-bleached ruins where a squire learned that armor does not make you what you want to be. All of those places are behind the journey now. This last chapter has no walls. It is the space between all the places that were visited, the silence at the end of an archive after the last file has been opened and set down. The Brotherhood of Steel began with a man who read a history book and decided civilization needed a new kind of guardian. The specific book is not in any record. The specific passage, the one about the Knights Templar that gave Maxon his model for what the Brotherhood's structure should be, is not preserved in any archive the Brotherhood maintains. The institution that built itself on the premise that nothing worth knowing should ever be lost has lost the exact thought that started it. The origin of the Brotherhood of Steel is filed under unknown in the archive of the organization the thought created. That is not a failure of record keeping. It is an honest consequence of how beginnings work. The thing that starts everything is rarely the thing that gets written down first. The voice that writes everything down afterward was formed at Mariposa. Every major Brotherhood document from that facility forward uses the same construction. Things were done. Experiments were conducted. Soldiers were lost. The passive voice removes the actor from the action. It preserves the event while making the person responsible for the event harder to locate in the sentence. Mariposa was where the Brotherhood first encountered something so difficult to describe in active language that the passive voice became the only available register, describing horror through the grammar of administrative process. Because the grammar of administrative process creates a distance between the writer and what is being written about that makes the writing possible. The voice became the institution's voice. The institution became the voice. 200 years of Brotherhood records are written in a language that was developed at Mariposa to make the first thing written in that language survivable to write. From Mariposa, the path led to the hub, to the room above the trading post where Brotherhood agents watched the post-war world being rebuilt by the people living in it. The traders below were improvising and participating and building something that was messy and alive. The Brotherhood was filing reports about it. Both were trying to survive the same world. One was surviving it by engaging with it directly. The other was surviving it by documenting it from a position of deliberate remove. The records from the hub outpost are meticulous and complete by Brotherhood standards. The hub itself, in those same years, was full of commerce and movement and the complicated human activity that produces things like caravans and trading disputes, and a city that grows because people need it to exist. The relationship between documentation and living has always been the Brotherhood's deepest unresolved question. Whether the act of recording something is a form of participation in it or a substitution for participation, and whether the Brotherhood has ever been certain which one it was doing. The Midwestern Brotherhood answered that question differently. They went into the field, lost contact with the archive, and became something the archive would not have permitted them to become. They recruited ghouls and super mutants. They used a general's rank instead of an elder's title. They built their institutional identity from what was available in the Midwest, rather than from the tradition that Lost Hills had preserved. They may have failed. Their story ends without resolution, mid-sentence, in the middle of a word that was never finished. But the Midwestern Brotherhood was attempting something the West Coast chapter never fully attempted, which was to let the world it was operating in change what the Brotherhood was, rather than using the Brotherhood's institutional weight to prevent that change from occurring. The Brotherhood that maintained its connection to the archive preserved more of what it had been. The Brotherhood that lost that connection became something different. The distance between those two outcomes is the entire width of the continent, and neither outcome is straightforwardly better than the other. The Citadel stands at the center of what the Brotherhood preserved and what it moved into. The ruins of the Pentagon, the building that oversaw the development of the weapons that ended the pre-war world. The Brotherhood occupied those ruins and called it inheritance. They saw themselves in the building's history, its institutional commitment to military power, its mandate to protect a nation, without examining the building's record closely enough to notice that the institution they were inheriting had also overseen Mariposa. The difference between occupying the Pentagon as an act of irony and occupying it as an act of inheritance is the difference between an institution that can examine its own continuities and an institution that cannot. The Brotherhood has always occupied the second position. That certainty is the building they live in, and the building is the ruins of the place that built everything that ended the world they are now protecting. Above all of it, the Predwen moves through the sky and does not touch the ground. That is practical. It provides coverage and mobility and protection from surface threats that a ground-based installation cannot match. It is also the Brotherhood's institutional character, made into an image, an organization that has decided not to be vulnerable to the world it is protecting, rendered as an object that literally does not land. Elder Maxon dreams of the Citadel training yard from a ship that never touches the earth. The most powerful Brotherhood leader in the post-war East carries, in his private terminal, the memory of a courtyard and a morning before everything became what it became, while commanding a vessel that has structured its entire existence around not returning to the ground where that courtyard was. The institution's greatest engineering achievement is also its clearest statement about what the institution has chosen. Above, apart, watching, still certain that watching from above is the same as protecting what is below. Paladin Dance kept a list of his dead. He kept it in a personal terminal in a forward position in Cambridge, and he showed it to no one, and presumably he read it alone. And then he closed the terminal and continued with the maintenance schedule that was the next item in the operational log. The Brotherhood has always been made of people who closed the terminal and continued. The institution's endurance is built from an accumulation of individual decisions, made in private, to keep going after the thing that would have justified stopping. Those decisions are not in the official archive. They are in the personal terminals and the private logs and the gaps between the professional entries. In the 11 days at Seneca Rocks, between the last personal word and the last official one. In the list of 6 names that precedes a maintenance schedule. In the 30 seconds of silence at the beginning of the briefing that follows a loss. The Brotherhood's real foundation is not the doctrine or the armor or the archive. It is in the files its members kept for themselves, in the spaces the institution did not ask for and did not receive, that exist in the record anyway, because the people who wrote them needed to write them. Fort Defiance ended without being retrieved. The Appalachian chapter's archive sat in a powered building in the mountains, readable, waiting, and the broader Brotherhood did not send anyone to read it. The Seed Vault sat uncatalogued. The pending review of the Scorched Plague's organizational structure, the most important analytical finding the chapter had produced, remained pending. The Brotherhood of Steel was founded on the proposition that knowledge worth preserving should never be lost. And the Appalachian chapter's collected knowledge sat unread for decades, in a building that still had power. The institution that would not let the pre-war world be forgotten, forgot its own forward position. The archive that the Brotherhood promised the wasteland it would keep, the Brotherhood could not keep its own version of. Fort Defiance is not a military failure. It is the Brotherhood's institutional promise, meeting the limits of the institution's actual reach. In a mountain building with the lights still on, in records addressed to a reader who took too long to arrive. And then there is the unnamed object on the shelf at Seneca Rocks. The small thing with no item tag, placed on a shelf in the sleeping area of a 2-person observation post by someone who wanted the space to feel inhabited by a specific person. It has no file. It has no name in any Brotherhood record. It cannot be examined or moved. It sits on the shelf in the way that personal objects sit on shelves, present, uncatalogued, belonging to someone in a way that the institution does not have a category for. In the context of everything the journey has covered, the sealed vaults and the armories, and the classified assessments and the pending reviews, and the administrative language developed to make horror writable, the unnamed object on the shelf at Seneca Rocks is the detail that stays. Not because it is more important than the other details, because it is the detail that the Brotherhood's archive did not ask for and did not receive and cannot account for. It is the thing that exists outside the filing system, in the space the filing system was never designed to reach. The scribe at Seneca Rocks wrote that a rock formation visible from the outpost window was unreasonably beautiful. This was not in the mission brief. It was not strategically relevant. It was not a detail the Brotherhood's archive asked for, and it is not a detail the archive contains in any official capacity. It exists in a personal log that the institution did not request, found in a corner of the Appalachian Mountains that most people who played Fallout 76 did not visit. The 147 files opened across this journey have moved through the most powerful military organization in the post-war world, through its armories and archives, its classified assessments and conduct reviews, its engineering failures and institutional ironies, and the slow, honest documentation of a chapter that ended without being saved. The detail that sits at the end of all of it, quiet and specific and impossible to file under any Brotherhood category, is a person on a mountain who looked out a window and wrote that something was beautiful, in a log that nobody asked for reasons that the archive does not record. The Brotherhood preserved technology. It preserved doctrine. It preserved, with extraordinary commitment and genuine cost, the memory of a pre-war civilization that used all of its preserved technology to end itself. The scribe at Seneca Rocks preserved something smaller, a note about fog, a note about light on rock, an unreasonable beauty, filed in no intended archive, in a personal log that exists alongside the official one, because the person writing the official log was also a person who noticed things that the official log had no column for. That is what the Brotherhood's archive, in the end, most honestly contains, not the weapons or the protocols or the sealed assessments, but the evidence, accumulated across 14 locations and 147 files, that the people inside the institution were always more than the institution had a category for. The bombs fell. The vaults sealed. A captain walked away from a facility carrying a photograph of his son. The Brotherhood marched. It built bunkers and fortresses and an airship that never lands. It filed everything it could reach and classified everything it could not explain, and kept the things it had decided not to act on under pending review for longer than most institutions last. It is still running. The archive is still accumulating. The questions it asked itself on its very first night have still not been answered, and the files are still open, and somewhere in the lower levels of every Brotherhood installation that still has power, in the maintenance schedules, and the inventory lists, and the conduct reports, and the quiet personal logs that nobody asked for, the record continues. Tonight, the files were opened. Now, quietly, they close. Rest well. The archive keeps.